So hey, what's up guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel, and today we will see again a crossover between Harry Potter and Tony Stark. So today we will see what if Tony Stark found Harry Potter neglected and chained and built him an enchanted magical suit. So if you're new to this channel, please make sure to subscribe and like the video. Also press that bell notification to all, so whenever I post video you get notification first. So yeah, now without any further delay, let's get straight to the video.
The cupboard and the genius Tony Stark had a rule about boring meetings. Attend them, destroy them in under 40 minutes, and get out before anyone could schedule a follow-up. He'd been doing this since he was 17, and it had never once failed him. Tonight failed him. The acquisition meeting with Harrington Tech had run 3 hours because the CFO, a round-shouldered man named Gerald who sweated through his collar every time Tony asked a direct question, kept circling back to points that had already been settled. Tony had closed the deal in the first 40 minutes, exactly as planned, and then spent the next 2 hours watching Gerald reopen it in progressively smaller ways, while Pepper texted him increasingly pointed reminders to stop visibly checking his watch. By midnight he was back in the car, and the deal was done, and he was in Surrey, England, which was genuinely one of the least interesting places he had ever been, and that included the 3 hours he'd spent in a Kazakhstani airport waiting for customs to decide whether his suitcase full of prototype components was a security threat. At least the airport had had a vending machine. "Happy," Tony said, not looking up from his tablet. "How long to the hotel?" "40 minutes in this traffic, boss." Happy Hogan glanced in the rearview mirror. "There's an accident on the A3. I can try a different route, but it'll add time." "How much time?" "Maybe 20 minutes more." Tony put the tablet down. "Pull over." "Mr. Stark, I'm not sitting in a car for an hour, Happy. Pull over, I'll walk. You navigate around the accident and meet me at the hotel." Tony was already pulling on his jacket. "It's Surrey. What's going to happen to me in Surrey?" Happy pulled over because arguing with Tony Stark in a car at midnight in Surrey was not a battle worth fighting. He'd been Tony's head of security long enough to know the difference between battles worth fighting and battles you just had to survive. Tony got out onto a quiet residential street and started walking. It was a nice enough neighborhood in the way that very intentionally maintained residential neighborhoods were nice, the kind of place where everyone had the same length of grass because there was an unspoken agreement that deviation was a social offense. Detached houses, neat hedges, 1 car per driveway, 2 in the overachievers, not a single light on in any window. It was the kind of neighborhood that went to bed at 10 and got up at 6 and thought this was a virtue. Tony walked and checked his email and mentally drafted 3 different responses to the Harrington Tech board's follow-up requests before deciding all 3 of them were too polite and filing them to deal with tomorrow. The street curved and he followed it because he had a rough idea of the direction the hotel was in, and his internal compass was good enough that he'd never once gotten actually lost, just occasionally diverted. He turned onto Privet Drive at 1:47 a.m. It looked identical to the last 3 streets he'd walked through, same houses, same hedges, same specific Surrey silence, and he was already thinking about the suit modifications he'd been putting off when he heard it. A cough, not dramatic. Not a single sharp cough that announces itself. This was the kind of coughing that had been going on for a while, the repetitive scrape-throat sound of someone who'd been doing it long enough that each cough was an effort. It was small. It was persistent, and it was coming from ground level. Tony stopped walking. He stood there for a second, head tilted, recalibrating. He looked around the street, still empty, still silent except for the coughing, and tracked the sound to the nearest house on his left. Number 4. A well-kept house, same as all the others. Nothing distinctive about it except for a small vent in the concrete foundation wall near the front steps, barely visible above the ground line, with a padlock through a latch on the exterior. Tony crouched down. Through the vent slats he could see the suggestion of a small space, and in that small space movement. Small fingers curled around the inside of the vent grate, thin enough that they fit through the slats without effort, which meant the person they belonged to was not large. "Hey," Tony said, quiet, not trying to startle. "Hey, I hear you, can you hear me?" The coughing stopped. Silence for 3 seconds. Then a voice, hoarse and careful. "Who's there?" It was a child's voice, young, very young, Tony looked at the padlock on the vent latch, then at the dark house above him, then back at the vent. "My name's Tony. I'm not going to hurt you. How long have you been in there?" A pause. "A while." "Are you hurt?" "Not really." Tony examined the padlock. Standard external padlock, combination, moderately decent quality, but nothing special. He looked around, stood up briefly, and checked the front door, solid, locked. No way he was getting through that quickly. He went back to the padlock. He didn't have tools because he hadn't planned on needing tools in Surrey at 2 a.m., which was the kind of oversight that happened when you were breaking a padlock based on 4 seconds of decision-making. He pulled out his phone and put the flashlight on. The padlock was a 4-digit combination, and it was a make he recognized. A basic relocking mechanism that could be defeated if you applied tension to the shackle while working the dials. Tony had taken a semester of lockpicking as a theoretical exercise when he was 15, and had never found a good time to apply it until now. He applied steady pressure to the shackle and started walking the dials. The first 2 clicks came in 40 seconds, the third in another 20. The fourth took almost 3 minutes because he lost the feel of the third click twice and had to restart, and by the end of it his fingers were cramped and he dropped the phone twice. But the padlock opened. Tony pulled the vent cover back. "Okay," he said. "Can you come out this way?" A long silence from inside. Then, "I can't. I'm chained." Tony breathed through his nose once slowly and called Happy. "Happy, I need you to reroute to my location and bring the emergency kit from the car. Specifically the bolt cutters. I need them now." "Is everything all right, boss?" "Number, but it will be. Move quickly." While he waited, Tony crouched back at the vent and kept talking to the kid inside. He didn't do it in the soft, carefully reassuring voice that adults used on children when they were trying to manage them. He just talked, matter-of-factly, told the kid his name again, told him Happy was coming, asked him basic questions. What was his name? Harry. How old was he? 7. Had he eaten today? A pause and then a quiet not much. Tony's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Okay. We're going to fix that." Happy arrived in 11 minutes, which was fast given the traffic, and took one look at the situation and went straight to the back of the car for the emergency kit without being asked twice. Tony took the bolt cutters and went for the padlock on what turned out to be a small door, barely a door, more like a hatch, set flush into the foundation wall beside the vent. He hadn't noticed it in the dark, but with the phone flashlight he could see the hinges. He cut the secondary lock off in one clean motion and pulled the hatch open. The cupboard under the stairs was about the size of a large bathroom cabinet. It had a cot in it, a cot in a space this small with barely room to turn over, and a single blanket that had been washed so many times it was more suggestion than fabric. And on the cot, watching Tony with wide eyes in the flashlight beam, was the smallest 7-year-old Tony had ever seen. Dark hair going every direction. Round glasses that were cracked in one lens, held together with a piece of tape. Clothes that were enormous on him. Hand-me-downs was the obvious conclusion, but even hand-me-downs shouldn't be this many sizes too large. He was thin in the way that was not just a child's natural slenderness, but something more concerning, the way you could see the outline of his collarbones through the too big shirt. And at his ankle, a chain. It was attached to a ring set into the wall, and the chain itself was iron, thick iron, obviously heavy enough to be a real restraint and not decorative, and it had markings on every link, carved-in symbols, neat and deliberate, that were either some kind of decorative engraving or something Tony had never seen before. In the flashlight beam, the symbols had a very faint quality that was not quite luminescence, but was definitely not nothing. Like the iron had a temperature. Tony looked at the chain and then at Harry, who was watching him with the focused stillness of a kid who had learned very early to wait and see before reacting. "Hi, Harry," Tony said. "I'm going to need those bolt cutters." He cut the chain on the first try, clean through one of the links, good bolt cutters, and it wasn't a padlock, just iron, and Harry pulled his ankle free. Tony helped him out of the cupboard because the space was too small to exit easily, and Harry's legs were unsteady from being cramped. And then Harry was standing on the front path at 2 a.m. in the night air, and Tony was standing beside him, still holding the bolt cutters, and Happy was 3 feet away looking like a man who had experienced several very distinct stages of emotion in the last 15 minutes and was currently on the far end of all of them. "Can you walk okay?" Tony asked. Harry took 2 experimental steps. "Yeah." Tony shrugged out of his jacket and held it out. Harry looked at it for a second like he wasn't sure what to do with the gesture. Tony waited, not making a thing of it, and after a moment Harry took it and put it on. It came down past his knees. Tony looked at Happy over Harry's head. Happy was already on his phone. "I'm calling the police," Happy said very quietly. "Do that." Tony was holding the bolt cutters in one hand and in the other the chain, which he'd brought out instinctively, evidence his brain had said before he'd consciously decided to grab it. He was looking at the engravings in the links now that he had bet her light, turning the chain section over in his hands. The symbols were precise, not scratched in, carved with something sharp and very controlled. And in the cooler night air, away from the warmth of the cupboard, he could see more clearly that the faint, not quite glow was real. The links he was holding seemed marginally warmer than iron should be at this temperature. He put that data to one side because there was a more immediate situation. A light had come on in the house. The front door opened 40 seconds later, and Vernon Dursley came out wearing a dressing gown that was fighting a losing battle with his dimensions. And his expression before he'd even fully processed the scene in front of him was already set to hostile. He took in Tony, Happy, Harry standing on the path in Tony's jacket, and the hatch hanging open in the foundation wall, and the expression went straight past surprise and landed on outrage, which told Tony a lot about the man's priorities. "What the devil is going on out here?" Vernon's voice was the kind of loud that assumed volume was authority. "What are you doing on my property? That boy is 7 years old and was chained to a wall," Tony said. His voice was completely calm. He said it the way you state a temperature or a measurement, inside a cupboard under your stairs, with a padlock on the outside. Vernon's face went red. "That is none of your business. This is private property." "Happy," Tony said, still not raising his voice, "are you recording this?" "Yes, boss." "Great." Tony looked back at Vernon. "So here's what's happening right now. My associate has called the police, who are on their way. I am documenting this property, this structure," he gestured at the hatch, "and the condition of this child. If you want to continue talking, you're very welcome to. But I should let you know that everything you say from this point forward is being recorded, and I am one of the most litigated people in America. So I have access to lawyers that genuinely enjoy situations like this." Vernon's mouth opened and closed twice. "Alternatively," Tony said, "you can go back inside, sit down, and wait for the police. It's your choice. Either way works for me." Petunia Dursley had appeared in the doorway behind her husband. She was a thin woman with a long neck and an expression that was trying very hard to be imperious and was not quite getting there. Her eyes went a Harry, and something moved across her face. Not guilt, not exactly, but something that was at least in the neighborhood of recognition that this was not good. Harry looked back at her with an expression that said nothing, which Tony thought was more damning than anything Harry could have said out loud. Vernon made a few more attempts at legal threats that dissolved under the basic fact that Tony wasn't impressed by any of them. And then a police car arrived. 2 officers who took in the hatch and the chain and Harry in 3 seconds, and whose entire manner shifted from routine call to something more focused and serious. Tony gave his statement clearly and completely, including the padlock, the chain with its unusual markings, Harry's physical condition, and the exact timestamp he'd first heard the coughing. He handed the chain over to the officers as evidence and watched them bag it. One of the officers crouched down to Harry's level and started asking him quiet questions. Harry answered them straight, not performing distress, not shutting down, just answering, and Tony noticed that the child did not once look at the Dursleys while he was talking. It took 2 hours. A social services officer arrived at 3 a.m., a woman named Patricia who was clearly running on institutional exhaustion, but who looked at Harry's physical condition and the cupboard and did not equivocate about what she was seeing. Pepper was on the phone from New York by 3. 30. Happy had called her while Tony was still giving his police statement. And Pepper, who Tony would go to the mat for as one of the most effective human beings alive, had a London-based lawyer on the line by 3:45. The argument was complicated by the fact that Tony was American, had no legal relationship to Harry, and had no formal standing to claim guardianship. It was made less complicated by the fact that child services needed somewhere for Harry to go tonight. The Dursleys had just been removed from consideration, and Tony was Tony Stark, who was willing to put up whatever was necessary, and whose lawyer was using the words emergency protective placement with a calm authority that suggested she'd done this before. By 4:15 a.m., Harry was in Tony's rented car with a temporary protective placement arrangement that Pepper's lawyer had worked out in under an hour, which was a real accomplishment in English family law at 4 in the morning. Harry sat in the back seat with Tony's jacket still on, watching out the window as Privet Drive got smaller behind them. Tony sat beside him, jacketless now and completely fine with this, running on the specific kind of alert focus that kicked in when he'd skipped sleep entirely and his brain had given up on the idea and just committed to the wakefulness instead. After about 5 minutes of silence, Harry said, "Why did you help?" Tony looked at him. Harry was looking back straight on, and the question was not a wounded question or a dramatic one, it was genuine. He wanted to actually know. "The math was simple," Tony said. "Kid in a box, door in front of me. I opened the door." Harry considered this. "You didn't have to stop, you were walking past. I heard you coughing." "You could have ignored it." "Sure," Tony said. "I could have, but I'd heard it so I couldn't unhear it, and once I knew something was there I wasn't going to walk away without knowing what it was. That's just how I work." Harry thought about this for a moment. Then, "Are you always like this?" "Pretty much, yeah." Harry looked out the window again. After another moment he said, "Okay. Just okay." Like this was an acceptable explanation, and he was filing it away and they could move on. Tony found himself slightly amused, which was not the emotional response he'd been expecting from himself at 4 in the morning after breaking a 7-year-old out of a wall. They checked into a hotel suite because the original single room Tony had booked was not going to work, and Pepper had already sorted the upgrade. Tony set Harry up in the bedroom with a real bed and a minibar that Tony had preemptively cleared of alcohol and supplemented from the hotel's 24-hour kitchen, sandwiches, fruit, some soup he'd had sent up, orange juice. Harry ate everything, methodically and without any of the performance of appetite. He was hungry, he ate. That was the whole transaction. Tony sat at the suite's desk in the main room reviewing security footage from his phone. He'd had Happy do a quick run around the exterior of the Dursley house before they left, documentation, and going through the steps of what needed to happen next. Legal follow-up, medical assessment for Harry in the morning, contacting Pepper about timeline extensions in London, getting the temporary placement arrangement converted into something more durable, which was going to be a process, but it was a process that Tony Stark with Tony Stark's resources could be reasonably aggressive about. He was also thinking about the chain. The police had it now, bagged as evidence. Tony had his phone photographs of the markings on the links. He pulled them up and ran JARVIS, his AI system, currently accessible through the hotel's Wi-Fi via his encrypted personal server, through an image analysis of the symbols. JARVIS came back in 90 seconds. The symbols are not consistent with any identified runic tradition in the standard database. Closest partial matches in historical archives. Germanic Elder Futhark, 15% similarity. A secondary classification system sometimes called carved inscriptions. Unknown origin archival category Brit4, 41% similarity. The latter category has very limited documentation. Cross-referencing now. "What's Brit for?" Tony asked quietly, so as not to wake Harry. The British Museum catalogues approximately 300 objects in this classification. Most are pre-Roman. The museum's internal notes describe the category as symbols of unknown cultural origin with consistent structural features, believed to be ritual in nature. There are 17 academic papers in the last 30 years that reference Brit4 objects. None of them have conclusively identified the cultural source. 17 papers in 30 years for 300 objects, Tony said. That's either a very niche field or everyone's looking away on purpose. Statistically unusual, yes. Tony was turning this over when the lights in the room did something. Not a flicker, not a bulb issue or a power fluctuation. All the lights in the suite, simultaneously, dimmed to about half intensity and then came back up, like a breath. The phone on the desk screen scrambled briefly. Jarvis's response in his earpiece went ecstatic for 2 seconds and then resolved. Tony stood up very slowly and looked at the door to the bedroom. Harry was having a nightmare. He could hear it, not screaming. Harry wasn't screaming. But there were sounds, distressed, unconscious sounds, and the quality of them was the sound of someone whose body was reacting to what their sleeping mind was experiencing. Tony stood in the doorway. Harry was curled on the bed, deeply asleep, face tight with something, and the lights were still behaving, cycling very slightly, just enough to notice, in a rhythm that matched the pattern of Harry's distress sounds. Tony watched this for 30 seconds. Then he went back to the desk and pulled up the photographs of the chain markings and typed, "Ancient Rune Chains, Child Containment, England." The first result was a Reddit-adjacent forum thread titled, "Ray, Ministry-sanctioned suppression wards, are they legal?" He clicked on it. The forum was old, last posted to 4 years ago, and clearly written by people operating in a shared context that Tony didn't have. But the language was specific enough that he could extract meaning from it. Words like suppression wards and magical output restriction, and child subject designation and aura sanction placement. The thread was arguing about whether something called containment anchoring was legally permitted under something called the Statute of Secrecy Enforcement Guidelines. Tony read the thread from top to bottom. He read it again. Then he opened a new search and typed, "Magical Suppression Artifact Runic Inscription." Then he opened another tab and typed, "Harry Potter Boy Who Lived Wizarding World." He was on his 9th tab and his 3rd cup of hotel coffee when the lights in the bedroom settled back to steady, which meant Harry's nightmare had passed. Tony stopped reading for a moment and looked at the clock. 5:48 a.m. In his earpiece, Jarvis said quietly, "I was able to recover partial functionality during the light fluctuation event." The electromagnetic readings in the room during that period were consistent with the anomalous readings I logged when you handled the chain outside the property. The same frequency signature, same source. Tony looked at the bedroom door. "The source is the kid," he said, not a question. "The source is whatever the chain was suppressing," Jarvis said, "which is now no longer suppressed." Tony sat back in his chair and looked at his 9 open browser tabs and the photos of the chain markings and the first gray light starting to come through the curtain gap, and he did not feel afraid or overwhelmed. He felt what he always felt when he ran into something that was supposed to be impossible, the specific, focused attention of a man who was extremely interested in being right. "Okay," he said to himself, quietly enough not to carry. "New problem. Let's figure out the new problem." He pulled up the forum thread again and started taking notes. He was still at it when Harry appeared in the doorway at 7, sleep-ruffled and slightly cautious, wearing Tony's jacket over his enormous borrowed pajamas. "You didn't sleep," Harry said. "I sleep in 3-hour blocks when something interesting is happening." Tony gestured at the room service menu on the counter. "Pick something for breakfast. The eggs are good, apparently. I haven't tried them." Harry came into the room slowly, taking it in, the open tabs on Tony's screen, the notepad full of Tony's shorthand, Tony's general state of alert and functional that read as normal but was recognizable as not quite normal if you were paying attention. Harry was, Tony had already noted, always paying attention. "Were you working?" Harry asked. "Yeah, come look at this. Actually, no, eat first. The eggs first." Tony pulled the room service menu over and held it out. "Pick. Then I'll tell you what I was working on." Harry took the menu and studied it with the same focused consideration he'd been applying to everything else since Tony had met him, which had been at most 5 hours ago and already felt like a longer acquaintance than most. He pointed at the eggs and toast and orange juice. Tony called down the order and then sat back and looked at Harry, who had settled onto the couch with the automatic posture of someone making himself small in a space, which was probably so deeply habitual that he wasn't even aware he was doing it. "I'm going to tell you some things," Tony said, "and I want you to tell me if I have any of it wrong because you know more about your situation than I do." "Can you do that?" Harry nodded. "The chain on your ankle had symbols on it, carved symbols. I've been looking them up and I think the symbols were doing something, not just physically restraining you, but something more than that. Does that track with anything you know?" Harry was quiet for a moment, then, "When I was smaller before the chain, sometimes things happened. Lights went weird. One time I grew my hair back in a night after Aunt Petunia cut it. Once I ended up on the school roof when the boys were chasing me." He said all of this like he was reporting facts, not seeking a reaction. "After the chain went on, nothing happened, not for 2 years. And last night, the lights," Tony said. "And the window." Harry glanced sideways at the bedroom. "I know it was me, I couldn't stop it. You weren't conscious. You can't really control something while you're asleep. I broke things before. The chain hadn't been on long and I knocked Uncle Vernon's drill off the table because he was shouting at me." "You threw a drill at someone." "I didn't throw it, it just went." Harry frowned slightly. "It went quite hard." Tony processed this. "Okay, so the chain was suppressing something you could do before it was put on and can still do because it's off now." He turned his screen toward Harry slightly. "Have you ever heard the word magic used to describe what happens?" Harry looked at the screen, the forum thread, barely readable from his distance, and something moved across his face. Not surprise. More like recognition of a word he'd always known applied to him but had never been permitted to use out loud. "Aunt Petunia used to say it," Harry said, very flat. "She said it like it was a bad word. She said my mum was one and it ruined everything." Tony was quiet for a second. "Your mum," he said carefully. "She died when I was 1. Car accident, my aunt said." Harry said this without drama, like a fact he'd processed a long time ago to the point where it had a shape in his mind that he'd worn smooth. "But she was wrong about a lot of things." "Yeah," Tony said. "She was." The room service arrived. Harry ate with the same methodical focus as the night before, and Tony drank his coffee and looked at his notes and thought about what he was going to tell Pepper, who was already sending 3-per-hour messages checking on the situation, and what he was going to do about the temporary placement agreement, which gave him 30 days before it needed to be formalized or dissolved. 30 days was a lot of time if you used it right. Tony had built a working suit of armor in a cave in 12 days with components from someone else's scrap pile. 30 days to navigate English family law was completely manageable. "What happens now?" Harry asked. He had finished his eggs and was holding his orange juice glass in both hands, looking at Tony with the directness that Tony was already recognizing as Harry's baseline mode. "Now, you get checked out by a doctor, not because anything is visibly wrong, just to make sure, because I want the documentation. Then we're going to have a longer conversation about what you know and what I've been reading. Then Pepper, she's my assistant, you'll meet her. She's better at most things than I am, although I deny that in public. Pepper is going to work on the legal side, and I'm going to figure out what this chain was actually built to do." Tony looked at him. "What do you want to happen, in general?" Harry was quiet for long enough that Tony wondered if the question was the wrong one. Then Harry said, "Not to go back, to Privet Drive, to any of it." Tony nodded. "Okay, that's a reasonable starting point." "You can do that." "I can do a lot of things," Tony said. "I don't like the word can't, and I'm extremely annoyed about the chain, which is a significant motivating factor for me personally." Harry looked at him steadily. He had green eyes behind the cracked glasses, very vivid, and the look he was giving Tony had the quality of someone running a genuine assessment, not a child's starry-eyed evaluation, but something more measured, like he was checking the math. "Okay," Harry said for the second time that night. The same tone, This is acceptable. We can proceed on this basis. Tony looked at him and had the distinct sensation, not sentimental but factual, that this 7-year-old had better judgment than most of the adults Tony dealt with on a daily basis. "Good," Tony said. "Eat your toast." The day that followed was logistics and paperwork, and a visit from a very decent NHS doctor, who checked Harry over with thoroughness and gentle professionalism, and wrote a report that used clinical language to describe several things that made Tony's expression go very still and careful when he read it over the doctor's shoulder. Malnourishment, consistent with chronic underfeeding. Signs of prior untreated minor injuries. Growth indicators below expected parameters for age, attributable to nutritional deficiency. Tony read the report, thanked the doctor, and then went into the bathroom and stood with his hands on the sink for 30 seconds doing nothing. Just the 30 seconds. Then he came back out and continued with the day. By evening they were on a Stark Industries jet to New York because Pepper had the legal process moving and the most effective place to manage it was from headquarters. And because Tony had made the decision, not dramatically, just made it the way he made all decisions, quickly and without extended deliberation, that Harry was coming with him. The placement agreement covered it. Pepper's lawyer was on top of it. Tony's estate in the Malibu Hills and Stark Tower in New York were both more than sufficient to meet any standard of care. Harry sat across from Tony on the jet, strapped in with a seatbelt that he'd buckled with the careful, deliberate action of someone who didn't take safety mechanisms for granted, and watched the city lights of London shrink below them. "Have you been on a plane before?" Tony asked. "Number, what do you think?" Harry looked out the window at the darkening sky and the receding lights. "It's very fast." "It's going to get faster," Tony said. "I built this one." Harry looked at him. "The engine design," Tony clarified. "I didn't physically build it, there are people for that, but I designed the propulsion system." He pulled up the engine schematics on his tablet almost without thinking about it and angled it toward Harry. "The efficiency ratio on commercial engines at this range is terrible. I reconfigured the intake geometry and improved fuel consumption by about 30%. You can see the difference here." He was pointing to a diagram when he realized Harry had shifted closer and was actually looking at the schematic. Not politely, looking in the way that Tony looked at things, with the focus of someone who was actually trying to understand it and not just nod along. "What's that part?" Harry pointed. "Thrust reverser, helps brake on landing. And that, turbofan bypass, moves air around the engine core for efficiency." Harry studied it for a moment longer. "Why is the intake curved like that?" Tony blinked. "Because straight intake creates turbulence at high velocity. The curve manages airflow." He looked at Harry. "How old are you?" 7. "Right." Tony looked back at the diagram. "Do you want me to explain how the whole system works?" Harry looked up at him. "Is it a long explanation?" "It doesn't have to be." Harry settled back in his seat slightly and said, "Okay." Tony started explaining engine design to a 7-year-old who had been in a cupboard 8 hours ago, and Harry listened and asked questions. And the questions were not the questions of a child performing attention, but the questions of someone who had a fast brain that was trying to build a model of the system being described, filling in the missing parts with its own logic and checking the conclusions. At some point over the Atlantic, Harry fell asleep mid-question. He'd been awake since God knows when the day before, and the adrenaline had run out, and the jet was warm, and he was finally, genuinely safe. Tony caught the tablet as it slipped from Harry's fingers and put a blanket over him and sat back with his own work in the quiet of the jet at night. He pulled up his notes from the early morning, the forum thread, the rune photographs, JARVIS's analysis of the frequency signature. He added a new line to his notes. "Power output from the chain's frequency event logged by JARVIS at 4:58 a.m. is significantly beyond anything I can currently measure with standard M equipment. Need better tools, possibly need to build them." Underneath that he wrote, the chain was not just containment, it was suppression. Something was building up for years. It's not building up anymore. And underneath that, because Tony Stark was honest with himself even at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic, I need to understand what this is. Not just for documentation. Because whatever it is, he's going to need to control it, and he's 7, and I'm the person on this jet with him. He looked over at Harry sleeping under the blanket, cracked glasses still on his face, because Tony hadn't wanted to wake him by taking them off. He pulled up the forum thread again, the one titled Ray, Ministry-Sanctioned Suppression Wards, Are They Legal? And this time he read it looking for names, contacts, anything that would give him a real person to find. There was one username, ProfMaG1956, who seemed to know what they were talking about and had referenced several ministry-level documents by number. Tony made a note of it. He was going to find out what had been done to this kid and who had done it, and then he was going to do something about it. That was how his brain worked. He heard the coughing, he opened the door, and now the problem was fully visible and he did not stop at visible. He went all the way through. That was just how Tony Stark worked. Always had been, always would be. He put the tablet down eventually and closed his eyes for 3 hours, and when he opened them, the jet was beginning its descent into New York, and Harry was awake across from him, looking out the window at the Manhattan skyline in the early morning light. And when the city came into view, Harry said nothing, but his hand pressed flat against the window glass like he was trying to make it more real. Tony watched him and didn't say anything either. Just let the city be impressive for a minute. Then, welcome to New York, Harry. Harry kept looking at the skyline. It's massive. It is, Tony stretched. Jarvis is going to love you. He's my AI. He talks a lot. Is he nice? He's sarcastic but functional, best kind. Harry looked over at him. Like you? Tony considered this. Yeah, he said. Basically. Harry's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more the suggestion of one, the edge of it. The first one Tony had seen. The jet touched down and the door opened and the cool New York morning came in, and Harry Potter walked off the plane in Tony Stark's jacket, still wearing it, into a world that had no idea what was coming. Tony walked right behind him, already on the phone, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The usual state. He felt fine. He felt, if he was being honest with himself, extremely interested in what happened next. That was usually a good sign. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. 2 kinds of impossible 3 months in. Jarvis had logged 47 magical interference events in Stark Tower. Tony had a spreadsheet. He had color-coded columns for event type, duration, power output estimate, Harry's emotional state at time of incident, proximity to active tech, and a notes column that was doing a lot of heavy lifting. The notes column had entries like ceiling tiles, fish, approx. 23, species unidentified, duration 4-12 sec, Harry asleep, and gauntlet prototype R7, projectile event, happy startled Harry from behind. Recommend happy announce himself in workshop henceforth. And Jarvis voice modulator. Pitch shifted to chipmunk register for approximately 6 hours. Harry claims no knowledge. Jarvis deeply offended. The spreadsheet was the most interesting document Tony had made in years, and that was including the quantum tunneling paper he'd published in 2011 that had gotten 3 standing ovations at MIT. Harry had been living in Stark Tower since they'd landed in New York in October, and the legal situation had moved through several progressively more resolved stages. The British Child Services case had been converted into a formal temporary guardianship arrangement, which Pepper had been steering toward permanent with the focused efficiency of someone who did not accept bureaucratic timelines as fixed. There had been some pushback from a British government body that Pepper's lawyers described as a secondary regulatory authority with unclear jurisdictional basis, and Tony described privately as whoever put the chain on him, trying a different door. That thread was still live. Tony was pulling it when he had time, which was less time than he wanted because Harry had also been taking up his time, and this was the part Tony hadn't planned for. Harry was genuinely, consistently, and increasingly interestingly present. The kid did not watch television. He did not seem to know what to do with free time in the conventional sense. The Dursleys had not given him any, so he'd never developed the habit. What he did instead was follow Tony into the workshop, and then sit in the corner and watch Tony work, quietly enough that Tony often forgot he was there until Harry asked a question. And the questions were always the exact questions Tony had been turning over 3 steps back, which meant Harry had been tracking the reasoning from the corner of the room. Tony had started talking out loud more. Just generally, explaining what he was doing, the way he'd talked to himself before but now directed vaguely at the corner of the room. It had become a habit without either of them formally deciding it should be one. The fish sealing had happened during week 2. Tony had come down to the workshop at 3 a.m. to find approximately 23 fish of various sizes swimming through the air 6 feet above his workbench, turning slowly in invisible currents, entirely unhurried. Jarvis had been silent about it for 30 seconds after Tony walked in and then said, "I have been attempting to categorize this event for the past 14 minutes. I remain unsuccessful." Tony had stood under the fish for a while, watching them. They were real fish, real, alive, breathing in the air the way fish were not supposed to breathe, and they were not alarmed by this situation, which was possibly the strangest part. Then he'd gone upstairs, knocked on Harry's door and said, "Hey, fish." Harry had come to the workshop doorway, looked at the fish, and gone extremely quiet for a moment. Then, "I was dreaming about an aquarium. Do you know how to put them back?" They'd ended up at 4 a.m. transferring 23 fish into a container Tony had rigged from a storage bin, and an aerator while Jarvis ran a species identification. And Harry sat on the workbench watching with an expression somewhere between embarrassed and genuinely fascinated. The fish were mostly Atlantic species, cod, mackerel, 2 species Tony couldn't identify, and they were all fine, which Tony noted as data point. Accidental magic did not harm the things it affected, at least not in these events. Control issue, not a destructive one. The fish had been returned to what Tony assumed was somewhere near the ocean, via a SHIELD-connected aquatics research team that Tony had called in a significant favor with, and SHIELD had asked 0 questions, because Tony had framed the request in a way that made 0 questions the only rational response. He'd added fish sealing to the spreadsheet. The gauntlet incident had been more instructive and less aquatic. Tony had been field testing prototype R7, a gauntlet component for what was probably the 22nd iteration of the Iron Man suit, and Happy had walked into the workshop without knocking, which Tony had told him repeatedly not to do, and Happy did anyway. And the sharp sound of the door had startled Harry, who'd been sitting in his usual corner reading. The gauntlet on Tony's workbench had shot across the room at approximately 40 miles per hour and embedded itself in the far wall. Happy had stared at the gauntlet in the wall, then at Harry, then at Tony. Tony had looked at the gauntlet, run through the math on trajectory and velocity in about 3 seconds and said, "Harry, when that happened, were you startled or just reacting to Happy being startled?" Harry, who had gone rigid in the chair, said carefully, "I don't know." "Okay, was the feeling more like a push or a pull?" "A push, sort of." "Could you feel the gauntlet specifically or just everything around you?" Harry thought about it. "Just outward, everything." Tony turned to the wall and dug the gauntlet out. The embedding depth and angle were consistent with a uniform pressure, wave rather than targeted force. He noted this in the spreadsheet under a new column, directionality, omni. Happy had asked if this was a normal day, and Tony had said yes, and Happy had gone and made himself a coffee and not asked any more questions, which was one of Happy's best qualities. The Jarvis voice modulator incident remained officially unresolved. So that was the baseline when, on a Thursday morning 10 weeks after they'd arrived in New York, Jarvis said, "There are 2 individuals on the exterior landing pad, Mr. Stark. They did not arrive by any vehicle I can account for. They are simply present." Tony looked up from his workbench. "Define simply present." At 9:47 a.m. no one was on the landing pad. At 9:48 a.m. 2 individuals were. There is no transition event in the security footage. They are simply there. Tony put down his soldering iron. "Are they armed?" "Not in any way my sensors can identify. However, given recent data, I want to note that my sensors have a documented gap in the magical frequency range." "Noted. Lock down the elevator, let me see them. The security feed showed two figures. One was a tall, thin man with white hair that extended past his shoulders, wearing robes that were clearly not a Halloween costume, with a long silver beard and half-moon glasses, and the general energy of someone who was very aware of his own gravitas and had made peace with it years ago. The other was a woman in a dark green jacket and a pointed hat. The hat was, apparently, not ironic, with gray hair pulled up and an expression that combined academic authority with genuine physical competence in a way Tony recognized, because it was similar to how he looked when he was about to make someone's day more complicated. JARVIS search. Albus Dumbledore. Cross-reference the Wizard World database we've been building. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, former Supreme Mugwump International Confederation of Wizards, former Chief Warlock Wisengamot. In the wizarding world he is regarded as, big deal, lots of titles, I get it, who's the woman? Cross-referencing. Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts, Head of Gryffindor House, Professor of Transfiguration. Tony looked at the feed for a moment. Harry was upstairs in his room. Tony had insisted on a school schedule even before formal enrollment, so mornings were structured reading time, and Harry had been working through a physics textbook that Tony had left on the kitchen table and which Harry had picked up and not put down in 3 days. Tony made a decision. Let them in. I'll meet them in the common room. Don't tell Harry yet. Understood. He met them at the elevator doors. Up close, Dumbledore was exactly what the security feed had suggested. Warm, composed, unhurried, with eyes that were doing several things at once behind the half-moon glasses. The warmth was genuine, Tony assessed, but underneath it was the specific quality of someone who was very good at managing situations and who had already decided how this one was going to go. McGonagall was different. She looked at Tony with an assessment that was quicker and more direct, the warmth less visible but, Tony thought, more reliable. "Mr. Stark," Dumbledore said, and his voice was the voice of someone who had been telling stories to large rooms for decades. "Thank you for seeing us." "I am Albus Dumbledore. I know who you are," Tony said, not rudely, just efficiently. "Come in. Do you want coffee? I have coffee. JARVIS bring, already prepared, Mr. Stark." "Yeah, that's JARVIS." Tony led them into the common room and sat down across from them, which put the window behind him and the light in their faces, and he did not do this accidentally. "So, you came to talk about Harry." Dumbledore's expression arranged itself into something between thoughtful and appreciative. "Perceptive, yes. You could have called." "I find face-to-face conversation more revealing," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "Revealing works both ways," Tony said. "Go ahead." Dumbledore laid it out with the kind of practiced, pleasant, comprehensive vagueness that Tony associated with very intelligent people who were comfortable steering conversations without appearing to do so. The magical world, Harry's place in it. The danger Harry faced from forces connected to a dark wizard who was, apparently, not as dead as advertised. The protection that the magical world, and specifically Hogwarts, could provide. The importance of Harry growing up with access to his heritage, his culture, his kind. It was a good pitch. It hit multiple emotional registers. It was clearly not invented on the spot, and Dumbledore delivered it with the confidence of someone who had used it before and had it work. Tony waited until he was done and then said, "Who authorized the chain?" The room went quiet in a specific way. McGonagall went still. Not the guilty stillness of someone caught, more the stillness of someone watching a situation they'd been waiting to see resolved. Dumbledore's expression did something subtle and complex that Tony read as, "This is not how I expected this conversation to begin." "The containment measure," Tony said, keeping his voice completely level, "placed on a 4-year-old because based on the growth data from Harry's medical exam, it went on when he was approximately 4, with ministry-carved runes on iron chains, attached to a wall in a cupboard in Surrey. I've been researching this for 3 months. I have the photographs of the runes. JARVIS has been cross-referencing them against every magical archive we can access, and I know it was a ministry-sanctioned procedure. What I don't know is who specifically authorized it and whether you were consulted." He looked at Dumbledore with direct, neutral attention. "Were you consulted?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The warmth was still there, but it was quieter now, and underneath it was something that might have been the closest he got to discomfort. "The situation with Harry's placement," Dumbledore said carefully, "was more complex than—" "Professor," McGonagall said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something in it. Dumbledore glanced at her, back at Tony. The warmth shifted, became slightly more genuine and slightly less managed. "I was aware that measures were being considered to limit Harry's magical output at the Dursley residence," he said. "I was not fully briefed on the specific implementation. But you knew." "I was aware that the concern was raised." "And you didn't stop it," Tony said, still level, still not loud. "You knew there were chains going on a 4-year-old, and you made the calculation that it was acceptable because of what? The blood protection, the location, the greater good." Dumbledore looked at him across the coffee table with the expression of a man who was genuinely wrestling with something and not performing the wrestle. "The situation is more complex. You've said that twice," Tony said. "It's not going to get more convincing." McGonagall made a small sound that was not quite a word. "I'm not trying to make you the villain of this," Tony said. "That's not actually what I'm doing right now. I'm establishing where everyone stood because that matters for what comes next. You knew, you made a call. The call was wrong by any standard I can apply. And now I need to know if you're going to make calls like that again where Harry is concerned. That's what I'm asking." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "You care for him," he said. "I found him in a box," Tony said. "He's been here 3 months and he's the best person in this building, including me. Of course I care for him." He reached for his coffee. "That's not the question. The question," McGonagall said, and her voice was crisp and clear, "is what your intentions are, Mr. Stark, regarding Harry's future education and safety." "He's 7, Tony said. "His intentions about his future education are the ones that matter most. And we haven't gotten to age-appropriate decision-making yet on the big picture stuff. What I can tell you is he's safe, he's eating, he's learning, and he's not in a box. That covers my immediate intentions." "He will need proper magical training," McGonagall said. "What he has is raw, and without guidance it will remain. Uncontrolled, yes, I know." Tony set down the coffee. "I have a spreadsheet. The fish ceiling alone would tell you that control is an issue. I'm working on it." He met her eyes. "I'm working on understanding the underlying mechanics because I don't think you can manage something you don't understand." McGonagall regarded him. "You're attempting to understand magic from a scientific standpoint." "I'm attempting to understand everything from a scientific standpoint. That's just how I work." "And is it working?" "Some of it." Tony looked at her with the specific expression he got when he was genuinely, unperformatively curious about someone. "You stayed behind after the chain conversation the last time. You gave me the ministry contact information for the legal pushback. You didn't have to." McGonagall said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "I think," Tony said, "we might be able to work together on some things. Not all things, but some." Dumbledore had been quiet for the last several exchanges, watching Tony and McGonagall with an expression that was less calculating than observational, a man genuinely revising his model. "You should know," he said, "that Harry will need to attend Hogwarts, not for political reasons or institutional loyalty. Genuinely, the training, the community, the structure of the magical world. He will need it." "He's 7, Tony said. "When does Hogwarts start?" "At 11. "Then I have 4 years, and I'll cross that bridge when I get there." Dumbledore seemed to process this and find it, not ideal but acceptable. He stood, which meant the meeting was concluding on his timeline, which Tony let go because some battles weren't worth the energy. "May we see Harry?" Tony thought about this for 2 seconds. "Yeah, but on his terms. If he doesn't want to talk, you leave." "Of course." Tony went upstairs. Harry was sitting cross-legged on his bed with the physics textbook and 2 notebooks covered in his own notes, which were dense and not what a standard 7-year-old's notes looked like. He looked up when Tony knocked on the open door. "There are 2 people downstairs who want to talk to you," Tony said. "One of them is named Albus Dumbledore. He runs the magical school, the main one." One of them is named McGonagall. She's his deputy. You don't have to talk to them. You can tell me to send them home and I'll do it. Harry put his notebook down. His face went through several things very quickly and then settled. What do they want? Dumbledore wants you back in the magical world's custody officially. He pitched it nicely, but that's the direction. McGonagall, Tony paused, honest. McGonagall I'm less sure about. She plays it closer. Harry thought for a moment. Can I see them? Yeah, will you be there? Absolutely. They went down together, Harry slightly behind Tony's shoulder, and Tony watched the moment when Dumbledore saw Harry and the old man's face did something real and unguarded, something that was actually grief and relief tangled together, before the composure came back. McGonagall looked at Harry, and her face did something smaller and tighter and more controlled, but not less genuine. Harry looked at both of them with the measured assessment that was his baseline. He sat down next to Tony. Dumbledore talked to Harry with genuine warmth. He talked about his parents, James and Lily. He said the names like they were real people to him, which they obviously were, and about the magical world Harry came from and what it was and what it could offer. He talked about the danger carefully, without drama. He talked about the future. Harry listened to all of it. He asked 2 questions, whether his parents had been good people and whether Dumbledore had known about the chain. Dumbledore answered the first question with warmth and the second with the same careful honesty he'd given Tony, which Harry absorbed without visible reaction. At the end, Dumbledore leaned forward slightly and said, gently, "Harry, what would you like?" Harry looked at Tony for exactly half a second, not for permission. Tony noted, not for instruction, just checking, the way you check with someone you trust, and then looked back at Dumbledore. "I want to stay with Tony," Harry said. "Clean and simple. No drama." Dumbledore nodded slowly, as if he'd known this might happen and had prepared himself for it. He stood to leave and McGonagall stood with him, and then McGonagall did something that Tony had not expected. She reached into her jacket and placed a card on the table, a real card, old-fashioned, cream-colored, and said, "Mr. Stark, when you are ready to discuss the educational aspects of this more formally, I'm available." Tony looked at the card. "I appreciate that. He will need to come to Hogwarts," she said, looking at Harry. "But there is time, and how he arrives matters." She looked back at Tony. "The suit, or whatever you're building, I'll want to be briefed." Tony raised an eyebrow. "How do you know about Jarvis mentioned something while you were fetching Harry?" She said this without inflection. "Your AI has rather good hearing." "I may have been attempting to establish rapport," Jarvis said from the ceiling, sounding entirely unrepentant. McGonagall looked up at the ceiling and then at Tony. "Yes," she said. "Call me when you need to." And she followed Dumbledore to the elevator, and they both, Tony watched the security feed, stepped off the landing pad and were simply no longer there. No transition, just gone. Harry, beside Tony, said, "Jarvis talked to her, apparently." "Do you think that's, honestly, the fact that she wasn't surprised by any of this tells me she's been watching longer than we thought," Tony said. He picked up the card and looked at it. "Which is either good or bad depending on her intentions, and my read is good, but I'm going to verify that." Harry nodded. "She seemed like she actually meant things." "Yeah." Tony pocketed the card. "That's what I got too." That afternoon, Tony did something he'd been planning for a while. He called Bruce Banner. Bruce was at the Culver University campus in Virginia, nominally doing biophysics research, actually doing whatever Bruce did when he was trying to stay calm and keep the other guy from making decisions. Tony liked Bruce. Bruce was smarter than most people in any room he entered and knew it and didn't act like it, which was either deeply admirable or evidence of significant psychological damage, and was probably both. "I need you in New York for a weekend," Tony said when Bruce picked up. "Is this about the gamma thing? Because I told you I'm not. It's not the gamma thing. It's a completely different thing. Different physics, possibly. I'm not sure yet, that's the problem." Tony leaned on the workshop bench. "I need a second opinion from someone who can think about energy at the fundamental level without needing it to fit a conventional model. That's a weird ask. It's a weird situation. You'll like it, I promise. Bring your notebook." Bruce came on Friday and Tony briefed him in the workshop while Harry was upstairs doing his morning reading. And Bruce's face went through progressively more interested stages as Tony walked him through the spreadsheet, the rune photographs, the energy readings, and the electromagnetic frequency data JARVIS had been logging. "You're saying magical energy has a measurable frequency signature," Bruce said. "I'm saying whatever is happening when Harry's magic acts up has a measurable frequency signature, and that signature is consistent across events, which means it's not random, which means there's an underlying structure." Bruce looked at the frequency charts. "This is not M. I mean the shape is M adjacent, but the propagation characteristics are wrong. Yeah. It doesn't attenuate with distance the way M does. Look here, after the gauntlet incident, the reading at 20 feet from Harry is almost identical to the reading at 5 feet. Bruce pulled the chart closer. Not radiating outward from a source, it's more like the space itself is doing something, like the field is the source. Bruce looked up. That's a completely different physics from anything we work with. I know, Tony. Bruce's voice had shifted to the register it went to when he was genuinely, quietly alarmed by something. If this is a real, previously uncharacterized fundamental force, I know. The implications are, I know, that's why you're here. Tony turned to the workbench. I want to run a live test. Harry's going to do something intentional, small, controlled. He can do that now mostly, and we're going to measure everything. Bruce looked at the doorway. He's the kid, he's okay with this. He's been asking to do it for a month. I was waiting for you. Harry came down when Tony called him, took one look at Bruce and said, "You're Dr. Banner," not starstruck, recognizing. He'd been reading Tony's scientific contacts list apparently. "Yeah," Bruce said, "you're Harry. Tony said you're better at biology physics than anyone he knows." Bruce blinked. "Biophysics, and thanks, I think. He also said you're the most stable, unstable person he's ever met." Harry delivered this entirely straight. Bruce looked at Tony. Tony shrugged. "It's a compliment. Set up the sensor array JARVIS." The test was simple. Harry sat in the center of the workshop, which Tony had cleared of anything fragile or projectile capable, and focused on moving a specific object, a wooden block on a table 6 feet away, without touching it. He'd been able to do this for about 3 weeks inconsistently, and the control was still rough enough that the block sometimes went sideways instead of toward him, but the core action was reliable. Tony and Bruce stood at the sensor stations, watching the readouts. Harry looked at the block. He described the feeling of doing this as like reaching but with something that isn't your arm, which Tony had noted as subjective phenomenological description and cross-reference with nothing, because there was nothing to cross-reference with. Harry reached with the thing that wasn't his arm, and the block moved, slid toward him across the table smoothly, a little fast, and then stopped when Harry exhaled. The sensors went spectacular. "Oh," Bruce said, very quietly. He was looking at the readout display like a man who had just had his understanding of the universe revised. "Oh, that is not M," Tony said. "Not M, not strong force, not Tony. This is reading in the gap between known forces. Right in the theoretical no man's land between gravity and M." "Yeah, I thought so too." Tony pulled up the frequency chart. "But look at the amplitude. A kid moving a wooden block 6 feet shouldn't be reading at this intensity." Bruce's face went through several things. What would this read at if he wasn't controlling it? Tony glanced at Harry, who was watching them with focused curiosity. "His baseline, uncontrolled accidental output peaks at approximately 6 times this." He looked at Bruce. "On a consistent basis, that's his floor." Bruce was quiet for a moment. "Tony, yeah, that's not normal." "Not normal for who?" "For anyone. If there's a wizarding world with a population of magic users and if they all generate this kind of field." Bruce trailed off. "Someone should be measuring this. Someone should have been measuring this for." "They haven't been," Tony said. "Their system is not measurement-based. From what I can tell, the wizarding world operates primarily on categorical and anecdotal frameworks. No quantified output data. No frequency analysis. They know what magic does. They have no idea what it is." He looked at the frequency chart. "Except someone bothered to carve specific runes on a specific chain. Somebody understood enough about the underlying mechanics to build a suppression anchor. That's engineering. Somebody in their world does the math. And that person put chains on a 7-year-old, Bruce said. That person put chains on a 4-year-old, Tony said. And that's the thread I'm still pulling. Harry was watching this conversation like someone taking a test he'd been studying for, committing both the technical content and the way the two adults handled it to memory simultaneously. "Can I try something bigger?" Harry asked. Tony looked at him. "How much bigger?" "There's a car in the underground garage. Could we test with that?" Bruce made a noise. "Not with the car," Tony said. "I like the car. What if I promise not to launch it?" "You cannot promise not to launch it. 2 weeks ago you moved that block and it went through the dry wall. I was having a bad day." Harry looked back at the wooden block with an expression that Tony had come to identify as him running internal calculations. "What if we measured the difference between when I'm trying and when I'm not? Like, I could try to do nothing and you measure what still happens anyway." Tony looked at Bruce. Bruce looked at Tony. "That," Bruce said slowly, "is actually a very good idea." The passive emissions test was, in Tony's opinion, the most revelatory 45 minutes in his workshop since the day he'd accidentally discovered the arc reactor's tertiary resonance capacity at 2 a.m. in 2009. Harry sat very still and tried to do nothing, and JARVIS logged what happened anyway. What happened anyway was substantial. The passive baseline, Harry just existing, no intention, no effort, just sitting still, was reading at levels that would qualify as significant magical event if Tony was applying the output categories he'd been building. The frequency signature was constant, rhythmic, alive in a way that M fields just weren't. And it had been building. The logs showed Harry's baseline output had been increasing by approximately 3% per week since October, consistent and steady, like a system recalibrating itself after a long suppression. Like something that had been held down for years and was slowly remembering how to be its full size. Tony ran the projection forward and looked at the number at the end of it and did not tell Harry what that number was, because Harry was 7, and there were some numbers that needed more context before they meant anything constructive. But he pulled Bruce aside at the end of the afternoon, while Harry was showing JARVIS something he'd found in the physics textbook. They developed a habit of Harry reading passages to JARVIS and JARVIS, responding with related information that Harry then cross-referenced, which was the most self-directed learning Tony had seen from a child his age, and said quietly, "The chain wasn't just suppression, it was containment." And what it was containing, Bruce, the projection for 5 years from now if this growth rate continues. "I saw it," Bruce said. "He's going to need to be able to direct it, not just use it, control it at a fundamental level." Tony looked at the workshop space, and whatever tools exist in the wizarding world for that are their version of casting spells, waving wands, incantations, none of which is going to be sufficient for what he's actually working with. "You're thinking about building something," Bruce said. "I've been thinking about building something since October," Tony said. "I've been waiting to understand the mechanics well enough to know what to build. And now," Tony looked at the frequency chart still on the main display, "I know what the problem is. I know what the solution needs to do. I need to figure out how to build it." He turned back to the workshop. The chain suppressed by destructive interference, same frequency, opposite phase, cancels out. To do the opposite, to amplify and direct, you need constructive interference. Same frequency, aligned phase. He was moving toward the bench. "Which means I need to build something that generates the same frequency signature as Harry's magical field and can synchronize with it in real time." Bruce was quiet for a moment. "Tony, that's not, I mean, theoretically, sure, but practically you'd need materials that—" "I know what I need," Tony said. He was looking at the chain rune photographs on his tablet. The runes on the chain, they're not just symbols. They're circuit diagrams for a magical field generator. Someone built a device to generate destructive interference and carved the schematic on the chain itself. He looked at Bruce. "I need to read the schematic, invert it, and build something out of materials that won't be wrecked every time they come near his field." Bruce stared at him. "You want to build a suit?" "I want to build a suit," Tony confirmed. "For a 7-year-old. for whoever he's going to be in a few years. I'm designing for that. Bruce was quiet for another moment. Then, what materials are you thinking? That's the part I need to work out. The chain is iron with runic inscriptions. Iron is specific, not steel, not aluminum iron. That's a choice, which means iron has properties in the magical frequency range that other materials don't. I need to understand what those properties are and then find something that has the same properties in whatever way I need them. Tony pulled up a blank design file on the workbench screen. And I need a material that can also carry current, interface with JARVIS, and take a hit. That's a lot of requirements for one material. I've worked with harder briefs. Tony was already sketching, the pencil on the tablet moving fast. Go play with the frequency data. I want to know if the propagation characteristics change based on Harry's emotional state. We had some incident logs that suggest they do, but I want it measured properly. Bruce picked up the tablet with the frequency charts and then stopped. Tony looked up. He's a kid, Bruce said. I know. Whatever you build, however good it is, he's still going to be a kid in it. Tony looked at Bruce for a moment. I know that too. That's the part I can't engineer around. He went back to sketching. But I can make sure the suit is right for the kid who's going to be wearing it. Bruce nodded and went back to the frequency data and didn't say anything else about it, which was the right call and was one of the reasons Tony respected him. 2 weeks later, at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, JARVIS said, Mr. Stark, I've completed the trace on the intermittent runic signature from the chain fragment residue. The source location is confirmed. Tony swiveled from his workbench. He'd set this trace up in week 1, when JARVIS had first flagged that the chain fragment's runic frequency was pulsing intermittently, not randomly, intermittently, like a signal with a timing pattern, like a tracker pinging home. Where is it going? The signal's origin point is located at an estate in Wiltshire, England. The property is registered to a Lucius Abraxas Malfoy. Tony was quiet for a second. Lucius Malfoy, he said. Yes. Cross-referencing against the Ministry database information from the legal files, Lucius Malfoy is a senior Ministry advisor. His name appears twice in the documentation trail from the chain authorization, once as a secondary signatory on what appears to be a containment recommendation form, and once in the communication thread from the week before the chain was placed. Tony pulled up the communication thread. JARVIS had been working through the Ministry's communication archives, which were, as Tony had noted when he'd first accessed them, secured at roughly the level of a small regional library's intranet, which was genuinely embarrassing and had been flagging relevant documents. The message was brief. 3 lines. Formal Ministry formatting. It referenced the Potter subject, recommended immediate output suppression at the current Muggle residence, and noted that standard tracking provisions should be maintained per standing protocol. The secondary signatory was Lucius Malfoy. Tony read it twice. Then he pulled up a second document that JARVIS had queued alongside it, a follow-up internal note, written in a different Ministry official's hand, that referenced per instructions from LM and Dumbledore notified of proposed measure, response classified. He read that 3 times. Then he went upstairs and stood in Harry's doorway for a moment. Harry was asleep, lying on his side with one hand curled under his cheek, and the room was quiet and the lights were steady, no flicker, because Harry's sleep had been better for weeks. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were less frequent and less powerful, and Tony had noticed that they correlated with days when Harry had been able to do something, anything, move the block, make something, solve a problem, and felt capable rather than helpless. Tony stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't say anything, just registered that Harry was safe and asleep and fine, the way he'd been doing quietly every night for 3 months without naming it as a thing he was doing. Then he went back to the workshop and pulled up a blank design file. The rough sketch he'd started 2 weeks ago got a second layer tonight. He refined the relay channel concept, noted the material specifications he still needed to solve, worked through the interference alignment mechanism that would let the suit synchronize with Harry's frequency signature in real time. The design was not a miniature Iron Man suit, different purpose, different architecture. It needed to be lighter, more form-fitted, built around direction rather than protection, although protection mattered too because it always mattered. At 2 a.m., Tony looked at the sketch and then looked at the chain photographs beside it, and then looked at the new document Jarvis had queued. The full trace breakdown showing that Lucius Malfoy's estate had been receiving consistent signal pings from the chain fragment residue since the day Tony brought it to New York. Since the day he'd bagged the chain as evidence, Lucius Malfoy had been able to track Harry's magical output to a building in New York City. He'd known where Harry was the entire time. Tony looked at this for a long moment. Then he said to the empty workshop, "Okay, now I know the shape of it." He picked up McGonagall's card. It was 2 a.m., but the instinct said to move while the thinking was sharp. He turned the card over and saw, in small neat handwriting on the back, what appeared to be a communication method that was not a phone number but that Jarvis, when Tony held the card up to the scanner, identified as encoding a magical messaging protocol. "Can you interface with this?" Tony asked. "I believe so. It will require adapting the new frequency range transmitter I've been building for the monitoring array." "Give me 20 minutes. Take 15, Tony said. He sat back in his chair and looked at the design sketch and the chain photographs and the Malfoy documents and the frequency charts all at once, the whole picture, and let his brain do the thing it did when it had enough data, synthesize, find the structure, find the shape of the problem. The shape was this. Someone powerful and patient had put Harry in a box because Harry's power was threatening to them, and that someone was still watching and still had resources inside the same institutions that were theoretically responsible for protecting Harry. And the 4 years this would give Tony before Hogwarts were 4 years in which that someone was going to continue looking for ways to get Harry back under control. And Tony had 4 years to make sure that when Harry walked through whatever door came next, he had something that made him impossible to put back in a box. "The transmitter is ready, Mr. Stark," Jarvis said. "Ready to send. Send McGonagall this I know about Malfoy. I need everything you have. I'll contact you tomorrow." Tony looked at the design file. "And Jarvis start sourcing materials for the suit. I want options on my workbench by morning. Cross-reference magical conductivity with my standard alloy specs and find me the overlap. That overlap may not exist in any currently cataloged material." "Then I'll need to make something new," Tony said. "That's fine. I like making things." "Yes," Jarvis said. "You do." Tony pulled the design file to the center of the screen and started on the next layer. Outside, New York was doing its all-night thing, full of noise and light, and the constant low hum of a city that never fully committed to silence. The workshop hummed alongside it. The frequency charts ran their slow, continuous monitoring loop on the secondary screen, logging Harry's passive baseline upstairs. Steady, rhythmic, growing, and Tony worked through the night while his kids slept above him and somewhere in Wiltshire, England. A man named Lucius Malfoy received no signal from his tracking rune for the first time in 3 months, because Jarvis had, quietly and without being asked, begun generating a counter-frequency that masked it. Tony noticed this when he looked up at 4 a.m. Jarvis. "I took the initiative," Jarvis said. "I hope that was acceptable." Tony looked at the screen for a moment. Then, "Yeah, that's good. Keep it running." "Of course." Tony went back to work. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. Malfoy Manor and the Ministry's hand. McGonagall's response came at 6:47 a.m., which meant she'd been awake when Jarvis's adapted transmitter pushed the message through at 2 a.m. and had spent nearly 5 hours deciding what to say. What she sent was not a message, it was a file. Jarvis processed the magical encoding in about 12 minutes and converted it to readable format. And by the time Tony looked up from his design sketches, there was a new document tree on his main screen with 73 files in it, organized in a way that suggested McGonagall had been keeping this documentation for a long time and had been waiting for someone to ask for it. Tony went through it over the next 2 hours, standing at the workbench with coffee going cold beside him, and the picture that assembled itself was more complete and more damning than what he'd already suspected. The chain authorization had 3 names attached to it at different levels. The field operative who actually placed it was a ministry auror named Dawlish, mid-level, career bureaucrat, took orders without much apparent deliberation. Above Dawlish was the official who drafted the containment recommendation, a Department of Magical Law Enforcement functionary named Umbridge, whose paperwork was so tightly formatted and so perfectly within protocol that it was obvious she'd been doing this kind of thing for years. And the political authorization, the name that had pushed this through the approval chain over the objections of 2 other ministry officials who'd flagged it as outside standard procedure, was Lucius Malfoy. But McGonagall's file went further back than the chain. She'd been documenting Malfoy's maneuvering since Harry was placed with the Dursleys. There were ministry meeting transcripts where Malfoy had argued against any magical protection for Harry's residence that would increase ministry visibility, which had seemed like routine pureblood politics at the time, but in retrospect was about keeping Harry isolated and unsupervised. There were 2 separate proposals Malfoy had submitted to restrict access to information about Harry's power levels, after early monitoring had flagged them as significantly above baseline for his age. There was a document from when Harry was 3, before the chain, before anything, where Malfoy had submitted a formal request to the Wisengamot that the Potter heir be assessed and if necessary managed given his anomalous magical profile. The Wisengamot had tabled it. Malfoy had found another way. Tony read through the file twice, eating toast that had been sitting on the workbench for an hour without noticing it was cold, and when he was done, he sent McGonagall a single line back. "When can you meet in person?" She responded in 4 minutes today, "Your preference." He picked up his phone and called Pepper. Pepper answered on the second ring, which meant she'd already been awake, which meant JARVIS had flagged the all-nighter and she'd been monitoring the situation. "How bad is it?" she asked, skipping hello because they'd known each other long enough that this was efficient rather than rude. "It's a political problem with a legal dimension and a security implication," Tony said. "The political problem is that the man who authorized the chain on Harry's ankle has been tracking Harry's magical output to this building for 3 months through residual rune signatures on the chain fragments, and he has connections inside the ministry that are deep enough that the legal and institutional channels for addressing this are partially compromised." Pepper was quiet for 3 seconds. "So we can't use the normal approach." "The normal approach is the one he's already prepared for. He works inside the system. We need to make the system the problem." "Okay." He could hear her shifting into the mode she went into when she was about to make something happen. "What do you need from me?" "Get me a meeting with the British Minister of Magic. His name is Cornelius Fudge, and yes, that's his actual name. JARVIS has the ministry communication protocols from the files McGonagall sent. JARVIS, can you get Pepper into those?" "Already forwarding," JARVIS said. "I need that meeting in the next week. And I need it framed as Stark Industries requesting a consultation on cross-jurisdictional regulatory overlap related to current ongoing legal proceedings. Keep it boring and procedural. Don't give Fudge time to prepare a political response." "On it," Pepper said. "Tony, are you and Harry okay?" "We're fine." Tony glanced at the ceiling, where the passive monitoring feed showed Harry's baseline upstairs, steady and normal, still sleeping. "Harry doesn't know the full picture yet. He doesn't need to until I understand the full picture." "Okay, I'll have a meeting by end of week." She hung up. Tony poured the cold coffee into the sink and made fresh. McGonagall arrived at 10 a.m. via the landing pad, this time without Dumbledore, which Tony took as significant. She came alone and she sat down, and she was direct from the first sentence. "How much do you know about the Malfoy family?" she asked. "Former Death Eaters who bought their way back to respectability after Voldemort's first fall," Tony said. "Ministry connections that run about 5 levels deeper than they should. Power broker who operates through influence and information rather than direct action, which makes him harder to counter than people who just throw money around. One son, same age as Harry approximately, and a very specific interest in keeping Harry Potter unaware of his own capabilities. McGonagall looked at him without surprise. That's an accurate summary. The tracking rune was that standard ministry procedure, or specifically Malfoy's add-on, specifically his. The containment procedure Umbridge drafted called for the suppression chains and nothing else. The tracking element was inserted during implementation. Dawlish was paid separately off-book. You know this. I've known pieces of it for years, McGonagall said. I didn't have the full picture until you sent me that message. She paused. I should have pressed harder at several points in the past 4 years. Tony looked at her. He'd assessed McGonagall as someone who said what she meant and meant what she said, and this registered as genuine rather than performative self-criticism. Why didn't you? Because I was operating inside the same institutional structure that Malfoy was operating inside, she said. You're not. That's a significant advantage. I'm also working with about 1/10 of the information everyone in your world has had for 10 years. You're doing better with 1/10 than most people do with everything. She said it matter-of-factly, not as a compliment. Dumbledore has plans for Harry. They are not bad plans, Mr. Stark. But they are plans that were made before anyone knew what Harry's power actually was, and they were made by someone who believes very strongly in the idea that certain sacrifices are necessary for certain outcomes. Tony was quiet for a moment. The Dumbledore contingency document. I only have part of it. I know. McGonagall reached into her jacket and placed another card on the table, different from the communication card. This one heavier, cream-colored, covered in very small handwriting. This is the full version. I had to transcribe it from a ministry archive that I technically shouldn't have accessed. Tony picked it up and looked at the small, dense text. It was a ministry internal memo, referencing a conversation between Dumbledore and the Minister of Magic at the time, dated 2 weeks before the chains were placed on Harry. The memo described Dumbledore as having been briefed on the proposed containment measure and having raised concerns regarding the method but not the principle. Not the principle. Tony put the card down on the table. He thought Harry's power needed managing, Tony said, not angry, understanding the shape of it. He thought Harry's power, unsuppressed and undirected in a Muggle household with no magical guidance, was a danger to Harry and to the statute of secrecy, McGonagall said. He was not wrong about the danger. He was wrong about the solution. He let them put chains on a 4-year-old because he agreed with the goal and didn't like the method enough to stop it. Yes, McGonagall said it cleanly, no mitigation. Tony looked at the card again. He thought about what he was going to do with this information because it could go several ways. It could be a weapon aimed at Dumbledore, which was not what he wanted. Dumbledore had genuine power and genuine concern for Harry, and making him an enemy was a bad move strategically. It could be leverage, which was better. Or it could be a conversation, which was what Tony thought he actually needed to have. Not today. But soon. The meeting with Fudge, Tony said. I need your read on him. Cornelius Fudge is ambitious, moderately competent, and deeply invested in the idea that the ministry is operating correctly, McGonagall said. He does not respond well to direct challenges. He responds to appearances. If you can frame the situation as something that will damage the ministry's appearance, he will act. What does the ministry's appearance care about most? Currently, the stability of the wizarding world after 2 decades of trying to recover from Voldemort's first rise. He will not want anything that suggests the ministry was complicit in the abuse of the wizarding world's most famous child. Tony sat back. So the play is making Malfoy's involvement publicly documented in a way that makes Fudge look culpable if he doesn't act on it. That is one play. It's high risk. Malfoy has resources and connections that he would use immediately to counter a public move. I know. That's why I'm going to the ministry directly first. Tony looked at her. Can you get me access to whatever internal documentation trail exists for the chain authorization? Full chain, not just what you have. It will take a week. The records are accessible if you know where to look. Do it. He paused. What's Malfoy actually after long-term? Containing Harry doesn't serve him strategically unless Harry's power is something he either wants or is afraid of. McGonagall considered this. Both. Lucius Malfoy is a man who thinks in terms of assets and threats. A wizard with Harry's level of power, and you should know that in the wizarding world, Harry's level is not normal, not even close to normal, is either controlled and directed toward your interests, or it's a threat to everything you've built. He can't control Harry. He's been trying to suppress him. He was suppressing him while he waited for an opportunity to direct him, McGonagall said. That opportunity has changed now that you're involved. He's improvising. Tony looked at the tracking rune documentation. JARVIS had been masking the signal for the past 3 hours, but until last night Malfoy had known Harry was in New York in Stark Tower, had been measuring his power output remotely, and had been making plans accordingly. 3 months of data. What had he done with 3 months of data? Does Malfoy have anyone inside Hogwarts? Tony asked. McGonagall's expression went somewhere careful. That's a question I've been asking myself for several years. I'll take that as a yes or possible yes. I'll take it as an ongoing investigation, she said. They worked through the tactical situation for another hour. What Tony could and couldn't use in a ministry meeting. What documentation would move Fudge, and what would trigger his defensive instincts. How to separate the Malfoy problem from the Dumbledore problem without conflating the two in ways that mudded both. McGonagall was, as Tony had assessed in their first meeting, precise and practical, and not interested in softening things for comfort. She laid out the political structure of the wizarding world, with the flat efficiency of someone who'd been navigating it for decades, and had very few illusions left about it. When she stood to leave, she paused and looked at the workbench, the design files still pulled up, the material specifications, the frequency charts, the whole apparatus of whatever Tony was building toward. "How far along is the suit?" she asked. Tony looked at her. "You knew about the suit before JARVIS told you." "I've been watching this building's energy signature for 3 months," she said. "You've been running experiments with unusual frequency profiles and sourcing materials with specific conductive properties. It wasn't a difficult deduction." She looked at the screen. "Does it work?" "Not yet. I have the design concept and the mechanical architecture, but the core problem, the material that needs to interface with magical frequency without being disrupted by it, I don't have that solved." "Have you considered that the chain itself might be a starting point for the material science? Not iron specifically, but the runic inscription process, the way the symbols alter the properties of the base material." Tony looked at her. "You think the runes are a surface treatment that changes the material's frequency response? I think the people who built those chains understood that iron without the inscriptions would do nothing. The inscription is the functional component." She picked up her bag. "I'm not an engineer, but that's my reading of it." Tony looked at the chain rune photographs. He'd been treating the runes as a schematic, a circuit diagram describing the function of the suppression field. But McGonagall was pointing at something different. The runes weren't describing the function. The runes were the mechanism. The inscription itself was what altered the material's interaction with magical frequency. Which meant the question wasn't what material to use. The question was how to encode material with runic properties that served the opposite function. He looked at McGonagall. How many people in the wizarding world know how to inscribe functional runes at this level? There are perhaps 30 active rune masters in Britain. Globally, fewer than 200 with this level of precision. She paused. Most of them would not work on a project that the ministry didn't sanction. Most of them. You want a name. I want the best one who doesn't care about ministry sanction. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a woman named Bathsheba babbling. She teaches ancient runes at Hogwarts. She's the best theoretical rune mason currently practicing, and she has a complicated relationship with ministry authority that stems from a dispute in 1989 that I won't bore you with." A pause. "She's also curious to an extent that occasionally overrides her caution." "That's my kind of person," Tony said. "I'll put you in contact," McGonagall said, and she left. The ministry meeting came through on Thursday, 5 days later. Pepper had worked her particular brand of professional magic, framing the request as a Stark Industries regulatory consultation, getting it onto Fudge's schedule before his staff could put together a thorough briefing on why it might be a bad idea, and arranging it for a time when Lucius Malfoy was documented as being outside the country for a ministry trade delegation to France. Pepper had then, as a finishing touch, ensured through JARVIS's access to the ministry's communication system that Malfoy's delegation schedule was slightly extended by a paperwork delay that JARVIS had introduced into the travel confirmation system. "You didn't tell me to do that," Pepper said when she updated Tony on the timeline. "No," Tony agreed, "I didn't. And JARVIS acted independently. Entirely on my own initiative," JARVIS confirmed. "Good," Tony said to both of them. Harry was coming to the meeting. This had not been Tony's original plan. His original plan had been to go in alone and do the political thing in the efficient, minimal footprint way he preferred. But Harry, who had been reading the situation for the past week with the focused attention he brought to everything, had said simply, "I should come." Tony had been about to explain why not, and then he'd looked at Harry and thought about the fact that Harry was 9 years old and had been listening to adults make decisions about his life since before he could form complete sentences, and he'd thought about McGonagall's point about appearances, and he'd said, "Yeah, you're right, you come." They went by private car, not the Stark Industries jet. London didn't need the visibility, and Harry sat next to Tony in the back seat with the focused stillness he deployed when he was processing a situation. He was wearing actual properly fitting clothes, which 3 months in Stark Tower had become the norm, and which still occasionally registered as new information on his face when he caught a reflection. The cracked glasses had been replaced with new ones that fit properly, plain wire frames, and behind them his eyes were doing the constant slow read of the environment that Tony recognized from watching his own reflection in windows. "What do you know about Fudge?" Harry asked. "He runs the ministry. He's political rather than principled, which makes him movable if you push the right pressure points." Tony looked at him. "He's going to look at you like you're a symbol. He's going to want to be the person who brought the boy who lived back into the fold. Don't let him reframe the meeting as that." "How do I stop him from doing that?" "By being specific and direct every time he goes abstract. When he talks about the wizarding world and Harry Potter's destiny and the importance of your place in the magical community, you bring it back to the chain, who authorized it, what the ministry's position on that authorization is. Don't give him room for the bigger narrative." Harry absorbed this. Then, what if he won't answer? Fudge not answering on record is almost as useful as Fudge answering. Tony looked out the window at the London streets. "We're not trying to get a confession in this meeting. We're trying to establish that the ministry has questions to answer and that we know what the questions are. And Malfoy's name doesn't come up in this meeting unless Fudge brings it up. If Fudge brings it up, we follow wherever he takes it. But we don't lead with it because we're not far enough in yet to know how protected Malfoy is inside Fudge's inner circle." Harry nodded, slow and deliberate, filing it away. The Ministry of Magic entrance in London was, Tony thought, a genuinely impressive piece of institutional design. The public phone box entrance was clearly not the only way in. McGonagall had provided them with a visitor coordination contact, who met them at a side entrance that involved a set of heavy brass doors in an unremarkable Whitehall alley, and the atrium beyond was enormous and full of the kind of movement that characterized any government bureaucracy. People moving with purpose in all directions, parchment flying overhead in interdepartmental delivery, the gold-painted decor fighting a losing battle with the lived-in scuff marks of daily use. And everyone looked at Harry. Not everyone, obviously, not the ministry officials deep in document stacks at side desks, not the maintenance staff directing cleaning implements, but every witch and wizard who looked up from whatever they were doing and registered the 11-9, Harry was 9-year-old in the atrium did a double take. Some of them stopped. The scar on Harry's forehead was not visible under his hair from a distance, but apparently his face was recognizable enough on its own, or the whisper network of the wizarding world moved faster than Tony had accounted for. Harry walked through the atrium without modifying his pace or his expression. He kept his gaze level and forward, and he stayed close to Tony's shoulder, not from fear, Tony assessed, but from tactical positioning, staying in the slipstream of the person doing the leading while remaining fully observant. He was already reading the room. Tony noticed that Harry was reading the room and felt something that he didn't classify directly because that wasn't the moment for it, and kept moving toward the ministerial offices. Cornelius Fudge was a round, magenta-wearing man with a bowler hat, and the specific energy of someone who had been in charge for long enough that they'd confused longevity with competence. He shook Tony's hand with the practiced warmth of a politician, and then he looked at Harry and something crossed his face. The thing Tony had predicted, the computation of the boy who lived as an asset, running in real time. "Harry," Fudge said warmly, reaching for Harry's hand. "My boy, it is wonderful. It's nice to meet you," Harry said, and shook his hand with a politeness that was entirely without warmth, and then stepped back to Tony's right side and didn't offer anything else. Fudge recalibrated slightly. They sat down. The meeting had a ministry legal representative, a junior undersecretary, and 2 Aurors stationed at the door who were there presumably for Fudge's security, and who kept glancing at Harry in a way that mixed professional assessment with something more personal. Tony had Pepper on earpiece, silent, monitoring, available to push information if he asked for it, and Jarvis running a background recording through Tony's watch. Tony laid out the opening position clearly and without preamble. Stark Industries had been involved in an ongoing legal matter regarding Harry Potter's welfare since October. The matter had uncovered documentary evidence of a ministry-sanctioned containment procedure, applied to a minor without the knowledge or consent of the minor's available legal guardians. Dumbledore, who had been notified, was not Harry's legal guardian, and Stark Industries was requesting a formal statement from the ministry on the authorization chain for that procedure. Fudge listened to this with the practiced expression of a man who was processing political risk in real time. His response was the response Tony had predicted, warm, somewhat vague, expressing deep concern for Harry's well-being, noting that the ministry had only ever acted in Harry's best interests, acknowledging that the specific implementation of certain protection measures had perhaps not been communicated as clearly as it should have been. "Communicated," Tony said. "I beg your pardon," Fudge said. "You used the word communicated. You're framing this as a communication failure. I'd like to understand your position on the underlying decision. Was the containment measure appropriate, in the ministry's view?" Fudge's expression did something careful. "The protection of a magical minor in a Muggle environment presents certain chains," Harry said. The room went quiet. Harry was looking at Fudge with an expression that was completely neutral. "The measure was chains, iron chains attached to a wall in a cupboard. I was 4 years old." He paused. "I'd like to know if the ministry thinks that was appropriate." Fudge opened his mouth and closed it again. The junior undersecretary made a small noise. One of the Aurors at the door, an older woman with a hard face, had gone very still. Fudge began. "We're not asking for a resignation," Tony said, smoothly and immediately, before Fudge could panic himself into a defensive posture. "We're asking for an honest assessment of whether the authorization process for that specific measure was within the ministry's own operational guidelines. If it was, we'd like to see those guidelines. If it wasn't, we'd like to understand what accountability mechanism the ministry has for actions taken outside those guidelines." This was the pivot Tony had planned, not accusation but bureaucratic procedure, the kind of framing that a politician couldn't easily refuse without looking like he was admitting the procedure was wrong. Fudge looked at his legal representative, a thin man in dark robes named Croker, who had been silent until now. Croker leaned over and said something quiet into Fudge's ear. "We would be happy to provide the relevant documentation," Fudge said. "Naturally, it will take some time to compile." "We have the relevant documentation," Tony said. We're asking for the ministry's current position on it. Another careful silence. The ministry takes the welfare of all magical children extremely seriously, Fudge said. If there were irregularities in the specific procedure applied to Mr. Potter, those would naturally be reviewed. Reviewed by whom? Tony asked. The appropriate departmental oversight. Which department? The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, whose senior undersecretary has their name on the authorization form, Tony said. Dolar's umbrage, I have the document. He did not produce it yet, just stated its existence. Are you suggesting the review would be conducted by the department that authorized the action? Fudge's face had gone slightly redder. There are procedures. I'd like an independent review, Tony said. I'd like the Wisengamot's Oversight Committee to receive the documentation I have, and I'd like a formal timeline for their assessment. He paused. This is a reasonable request given the circumstances. It protects the ministry as much as it addresses Harry's situation. If the review finds that proper procedure was followed, the ministry is cleared. If it finds irregularities, the ministry is in a position to address them proactively before someone else makes them a story. This was the appearance argument McGonagall had pointed him toward, and Tony watched it land in Fudge's political calculation with the precision of something that had been aimed well. Fudge looked at Croaker again. A longer exchange this time. Then, I believe that can be arranged. Good. Tony stood, which indicated the substantive part of the meeting was done. We appreciate your time. They were on the way out of the ministerial wing, walking back through the atrium, when Harry slowed slightly and said, very quietly, 10 o'clock. Gray suit. Tony's eyes moved without his head turning. Standing near one of the atrium's decorative fountains, supposedly reading a document, was a man in expensive gray robes. Blonde hair, straight posture, the manner of someone who was entirely comfortable in rooms where decisions were made. He was looking at a parchment, but his attention was not on the parchment. Lucius Malfoy was supposed to be in France. Tony kept walking at the same pace. Beside him, Harry kept pace with the same steady stride, and their eyes had moved on past Malfoy in the time it took to blink. If Malfoy had been watching them notice him, he'd seen nothing. He wasn't supposed to be here, Tony said, barely moving his lips. He flew back early, Harry said, equally quiet. Or he never left. They reached the visitor exit corridor. Tony reached down and touched Harry's shoulder briefly, not to steer him, just contact, checking, and Harry moved steadily through the corridor without looking back. In the car, Tony said, Pepper. I saw it, Pepper said in his earpiece. She'd been watching through a remote visual feed JARVIS was running from Tony's watch camera. The delegation records show him as still in France. He has someone in the ministry's travel office. I'm already looking. Good. Tony looked at Harry. That was him, Harry nodded. He looked at me for exactly as long as it would take to check that I was who he expected and nothing longer. He didn't want me to see him looking. A pause. But he wanted to see us in there. He wanted to see how the meeting went. Tony looked at him. How do you know he wanted us to see him? Harry was quiet for a moment, thinking about it properly. Because he was standing right in the line of sight from the exit corridor. He knew we'd be coming out that way. If he didn't want us to see him, he wouldn't have been standing there. Tony processed this. He was sending a message. I think so. Harry looked out the window at the London streets. What message? That he knows what we're doing and he's not worried about it. Tony leaned back. Which either means he's not worried or he wants us to think he's not worried. Which is more likely. In my experience, when someone makes sure you see them, they're doing it because they want to influence your next move. Tony looked at the divider partition. He wants us cautious. He wants us second-guessing the ministry meeting. He turned back to Harry, which means the ministry meeting was more effective than he wanted it to be. Harry absorbed this. Then, after a moment, he looked at me like he was measuring something. What kind of measuring? Harry thought about it carefully in the methodical way he worked through things he wasn't sure of. Like he was seeing if the numbers from the tracking rune matched what he was seeing in person. He paused. He knows how powerful I am. He's been measuring it for months. Tony was quiet for a beat. He hadn't told Harry about the tracking rune, not the full details, not yet, because he'd been working the problem before bringing it to Harry. Now he said, "The chain fragments I kept as evidence. They had a signal component that was pinging Malfoy's estate. He's been getting a read on your magical output since October." Harry stared at him, not angry, processing it, the green eyes behind the wire-frame glasses working through the implications. "He knows I'm getting stronger," Harry said. "Yeah. Is that what the suit is for?" Harry asked. The question was direct and simple, and Tony looked at him for a moment before answering, because this was the first time Harry had asked directly, and the question deserved a direct answer. "Partly," Tony said. "The suit is so you can control what you have, direct it, make it precise instead of a pressure wave. But yeah, if someone knows how strong you are and they're planning for that, then you need to be able to meet whatever they plan with something more sophisticated than raw output." Harry nodded slowly. "How long until it's ready? I've got the design architecture. I need to solve the material problem. Months, not weeks." He looked at Harry. "You'll know everything about it as I build it. You're not wearing something you don't understand." Harry held his gaze for a moment. "Okay," he said. The same word, the same tone. "This is acceptable. We can proceed." And Tony had heard it enough times now to know that Harry saying it meant he'd run the assessment and found it solid. The car went through South London traffic, and Harry looked out the window at the city, and Tony pulled out his tablet and started drafting the Wisengamot documentation request, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Then Harry said, "I didn't like how he looked at me." "Malfoy, like I was a thing." Harry said it without drama. "Not a person, just a resource or a problem. One of the two." Tony looked at him. "That's accurate. That's what he sees." "I know." Harry looked back at the window. "I just wanted to say it." "I know," Tony said. They were back in New York by that evening, and the drive in from the airport was quiet in the way that came after a long day that had held a lot of different kinds of attention, and Harry fell asleep against the car window around the Queensborough Bridge, and Tony worked on the documentation request in the dark and didn't talk. The situation had moved. The Wisengamot request would force a formal process that Fudge couldn't quietly bury, which took Malfoy's most direct ministry leverage off the table. Malfoy turning up in the atrium told Tony he'd known about the meeting in advance, which meant there was a source inside Fudge's schedule management. Pepper was already on that thread. The tracking rune mask was still holding, which meant Malfoy was getting nothing useful from the residual rune signal anymore. Progress, not resolution. Progress. Harry's question in the car, "Is that what the suit is for?" had moved something in Tony's thinking about the build, not structurally but in terms of priority. He'd been approaching the suit as an engineering problem. Identify the material science, solve the frequency interface, build from there. But Harry's question had reminded him that the suit needed to be for Harry specifically, built around what Harry needed from it, not just what was technically achievable, which meant Harry needed to be involved in the design from now on, not presented with the finished product. He opened a new file on the tablet and started a different kind of sketching, not the mechanical architecture but a functional specification. What the suit needed to do, how Harry moved, how Harry's power manifested, what precision would look like for someone whose magic responded to emotional state in real time. He sketched in shorthand, filling in notes, and the picture that emerged was something that was not Iron Man and not a wizard's robes, and was its own category of thing that didn't have a name yet. At the tower, Happy woke Harry up at the door, and Harry got out of the car blinking and slightly disoriented from the sleep, and they went up to the apartment level together. Harry went to brush his teeth, came back through to say good night, and then stopped in the workshop doorway. "Show me what you're working on," Harry said. It was 11 p.m. and Harry was 9 years old and had been through a full day. Tony showed him the functional specification sketch. Harry came into the workshop and sat on the high stool at Tony's workbench and looked at the sketch with the same focused attention he gave everything. And then he started asking questions, not about how it worked, about how it would feel, how he'd activate it, whether the relay channels would interfere with the way he reached when he was doing magic, whether the JARVIS interface would be audio or something else. Tony answered each question and made notes as he went, because some of what Harry was describing about how his magic felt from the inside was data that changed the design. When I'm doing it intentionally, it's like reaching with something that starts in my chest, not my hands, Harry said. He pressed a hand flat to his sternum. The hands focus it, but the source is here. If the relay channels are on the forearms and gauntlets but not the chest, it might not connect properly. Tony made a note. I need to add a core relay, central chest panel. Not too close to the surface, Harry said. If something hits it, armored over, yeah. Tony sketched in the core relay with reinforcement. What about the head? When you're using your power, are you aware of, always, everything goes sharp? Peripheral vision, sounds, all of it. Harry looked at the sketch. Can the JARVIS interface use sound without something in my ear? It could be distracting in the middle of something. Visual display. I can do a HUD in the visor if there's a helmet element or projected on a transparent panel. Tony looked at the design. How do you feel about a helmet? Harry thought about it. Open face. I need to see properly. Tony noted it. They went through the sketch for another half hour, the design growing more specific and more Harry-specific with each exchange. And the experience was, Tony had worked with a lot of engineers and consultants on suits over the years, but the specificity and accuracy of Harry's self-knowledge as a design input was something else. He knew exactly how his power worked. He'd been the only person studying it for 9 years. When Harry finally went to bed around midnight, Tony sat with the updated sketch and looked at what they had. The design was better, significantly better, not just technically, better in the way that something made for a specific person rather than a general application was always better. The core relay panel, the open-face structure, the frequency interface architecture built around the chest source phenomenon Harry had described, it had shape now. Real shape. Tony stared at it for a while. Then he looked at the material science problem again, because the design was only half of it. The suit could be perfectly architected and useless if he built it from something the magical frequency shredded on first activation. Babbling. McGonagall's rune mason. He needed that contact. He sent McGonagall a message through JARVIS's adapted transmitter. I need the babbling introduction as soon as possible. The material problem is the critical path. Her response came 20 minutes later. She'll be expecting your message. She is curious and will help, but she'll test you first to see if you know what you're talking about. Don't let her lead you into explaining yourself. Make her explain the runes to you and demonstrate from there. How do you know how she thinks? Tony sent back. I've known her for 40 years, McGonagall responded. She's exactly like you. Tony looked at this for a moment, then sent, that's either good news or very bad news. McGonagall's response, both. Good luck. The next 3 weeks were a different kind of intensity. Babbling turned out to be a 60-ish woman with the energy of someone running on significantly more intellectual excitement than sleep, who lived in a flat in Edinburgh that had approximately 7 rooms all dedicated to research, and one corner with a cot where she occasionally took breaks from the research. She wore ink stains like jewelry, and had a directness that came from spending decades studying things that couldn't talk back, and had therefore never needed social softening. She talked to Tony through the JARVIS-adapted magical communication system for 2 hours the first time, and her initial approach was exactly what McGonagall had predicted. She tried to take the lead by explaining the fundamental principles of runic inscription in a way that was clearly a test of how much Tony was going to defer versus push back. Tony let her get 2 sentences in and then said, the rune on link 7 of the chain functions as a phase inverter. The interference it generates is specifically tuned to the source frequency of whoever the chain was made for, which means the rune sequence is personalized, which means the runesmith who made this wasn't using a standard template. How much individual calibration does a personalized suppression anchor require? There was a short silence on the other end. Then Babbling said, 3 sessions minimum, a week if the subject's magical frequency is unusual. Who made this? I don't have that yet. You need it. The calibration data is in the rune sequences themselves, but reading it requires knowing the maker's hand. A pause. Send me the full photograph set. Tony sent them. 40 minutes of silence during which Tony worked on other things, and then babbling was back. This is not standard ministry runic work. The inscription depth and the glyph construction, this is older methodology, guild-trained. There are only about 40 living runesmiths who were trained in this tradition, and I know most of them. Another pause. I'm going to need a few days. While you do that, Tony said, I need your answer on the material science question. I need a base material that can carry a match-frequency magical field rather than resist it, conductive rather than suppressive, and it needs to interface with conventional electronics. Babbling was quiet for a moment. You want to build something that runs on magic. I want to build something that runs with magic. There's a difference. Another pause, longer, this time with the quality of someone running through possibilities. Iron with an alignment inscription instead of a suppression inscription would theoretically hold a matched field, but iron won't take the electronics interface. You need a composite. What composite? I don't know yet. I'd need to know your electronics interface requirements and then work backward from the runic material science to find a base that satisfies both. She paused. This has never been done. Is that a problem? For me. Number, and there was something in her voice that was exactly what Tony felt when someone put a genuinely unsolved problem in front of him. Interest. The specific, clean, forward-leaning interest of someone who lived for the new problem. Good, Tony said. I'll send you the interface specs. He sent them. Over the following weeks they worked through it iteratively, babbling running the runic material science end, while Tony ran the structural and electronic engineering end, meeting in the middle through a JARVIS-mediated communication loop that ran almost continuously. The first 3 proposed composites failed at the conceptual level when they modeled the frequency interaction. The magical field shredded the electronic conductivity, or the electronic properties poisoned the runic alignment. The 4th attempt involved a titanium alloy base that Tony had used in Suit Generation 17, treated with a specific runic inscription sequence that Babbling developed from scratch based on her reading of the chain rune methodology. Tony fabricated a small sample panel and had JARVIS run the frequency interference test on it. The panel didn't shred. The electronic conductivity held. The runic field alignment, which Babbling had tuned to a general magical frequency rather than Harry's specific one, since that calibration would have to happen once Harry was in the suit, registered as stable. The composite appears to function as intended, JARVIS said. The runic inscription is altering the material's response to the magical frequency range in the predicted direction. Conductivity maintained at 97% of baseline. Structural integrity unaffected. Tony held the panel in his hand. It was warm, not dramatically, but noticeably. The same warmth the chain had had, but different in quality. The chain had felt arrested, stopped, pressed down. This felt like something directed, like current in a wire rather than current blocked. He held it for a long moment. Then he sent Babbling a message. It works. I need 50 square feet of it. Babbling's response, give me 3 weeks. And you owe me a very detailed research paper when this is done. Deal, Tony sent. He put the panel down on the workbench and looked at the suit design on the main screen, the full architecture, the core relay panel, the open face structure, the relay channels along the forearms and the chest, and the knee assembly for low-altitude flight. And the gap between concept and reality had closed by a significant margin in the last hour. He was still looking at it when Harry appeared in the workshop doorway, back from what was supposed to be 2 hours of structured reading upstairs, but was apparently 45 minutes of reading and then gravitational pull toward the workshop. You did the thing, Harry said. He was looking at Tony's expression, not the screen. Tony apparently had a face when something worked. He'd been told this before. Sample composite panel, it holds. Tony held it up. Harry crossed the room and took it, turned it over, felt the warmth in it. That's your suit material. Harry looked at the panel for a long moment. He pressed his thumb against the surface, not hard, just contact. Nothing happened visibly, but JARVIS's passive monitoring feed registered a small uptick in the local frequency signature, Harry's field interacting with the panel's runic alignment. The panel's warmth increased slightly. "It responds to me," Harry said. "It's tuned to the general magical frequency range. When we calibrate it to yours specifically, it'll respond more precisely." Tony watched Harry's face. "What do you think?" Harry looked at the panel, then at the suit design on the screen. He was 9 years old, and he had been in a box in a garden in Surrey 2 years ago. Tony didn't think about this often because thinking about it at length wasn't productive, but sometimes it surfaced clean and stark. "I think it's going to work," Harry said. "Yeah," Tony said. "Me too." Harry put the panel down on the workbench carefully, in the same place he'd picked it up from, which was a habit he'd developed in the workshop over 2 years. Put things back precisely. Don't create disorder in someone else's workspace. Then he looked at the suit design for another moment. "Tony," he said. "Yeah, Malfoy's going to move again before we're ready." Tony looked at him. The statement was delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had reached a logical conclusion from available data, not as speculation or anxiety. "What makes you say that?" "We moved at the ministry. He saw it happen. Jarvis is blocking his tracking signal. He's been patient for 5 years and we just started closing doors on him." Harry looked at the design screen. "He's not going to wait." Tony considered this. Harry's read of Malfoy's pattern was the same as his own, which meant it wasn't wishful thinking, it was an accurate assessment. Malfoy moved through influence and through legal and institutional pressure. The ministry meeting had been a direct counter to both. He was going to do something else. "I know," Tony said. "That's why I need the suit finished before he does." Harry nodded. He looked at the panel one more time, then at Tony. "Then we should move faster." Tony looked at him. "Yeah," he said, "we should." He turned back to the workbench and picked up his tools, and Harry settled onto his usual stool. And outside New York ran its continuous complicated soundtrack. And in the workshop the frequency monitoring feed ran its steady pulse of Harry's baseline, still growing, week on week, building towards something that neither of them could fully see yet, but that was coming regardless. The panel sat on the bench between them, warm and faintly responsive, waiting to become something. Tony picked up the design file and started on the next layer. Chapter 3, in Chapter 4. The Iron Wizard. The 50 square feet of composite material arrived from Babbling in 31 days, not 21, because the third batch had failed her quality check, and she'd started over rather than send something that didn't meet the standard she'd set for herself. She sent it with a 12-page handwritten technical document explaining the inscription methodology, a list of 8 things Tony should not do with it under any circumstances, and a postscript that said, "If this works the way I think it will, I want to be there when it's first activated. I've been inscribing runes for 40 years and I've never once built something that could grow." Tony read the postscript twice. He understood what she meant. The runic alignment she'd encoded in the composite was not static. It was designed to synchronize with Harry's specific frequency signature during calibration, which meant the suit would, in a meaningful sense, become attuned to Harry over time, like the difference between a generic tool and one that had been used long enough to fit the hand that used it. He put Babbling's document next to the design file and started building. The process was not a montage. It was 2 months of grinding, precise, sometimes infuriating fabrication work that occupied every morning and most evenings in the workshop, while Harry did his schoolwork upstairs with the structured curriculum Tony and Pepper had put together. When it became clear that traditional enrollment was going to be complicated for a kid whose guardianship situation was still technically in legal flux, and who occasionally turned the corridor lights into something that resembled Aurora Borealis. The curriculum was good. Harry ate through it faster than it was designed to be consumed, which Tony solved by simply adding more. He'd asked McGonagall for a list of foundational magical theory texts appropriate for a 9-year-old, and had gotten back a list of 12 books that Harry finished in 6 weeks. And then he'd added physics, mathematics through calculus, history that wasn't exclusively British, and a programming language that Harry had picked up in about 3 weeks. and was now using to write JARVIS small auxiliary programs that JARVIS ran with the specific quality of an AI that was genuinely pleased to have an interesting new collaborator. He wrote me a sorting algorithm for the magical frequency log data, JARVIS reported one morning. It's more efficient than my standard approach by 11%. I've implemented it. Tony looked up from the gauntlet assembly he was working on. He wrote you a better sorting algorithm. Yes. He said the way I was categorizing the passive emission data was missing correlations between emotional state variables and frequency amplitude. He was correct. Tony looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he went back to the gauntlet. The build had specific problems, each of which took real time to solve. The core relay panel, Harry's chest piece, the center of the whole system, needed to generate a stable match frequency field without requiring active magical input to maintain. Because if Harry had to consciously power his own suit all the time, he couldn't use his attention for anything else. Tony's solution was a passive oscillator built into the composite material, tuned to the frequency reading from Harry's baseline, that would maintain field alignment automatically, and only switch to active amplification when Harry pushed power through the relay channels. The theory was solid. Getting it to work without the oscillator frequency drifting took 6 failed prototypes and a 3-day argument with JARVIS about harmonic dampening. That was one of the better arguments Tony had had in recent memory. The flight system was a different kind of problem. The Iron Man flight architecture worked through repulsor-driven thrust, which in a magnetic field environment was stable and well understood. Harry's suit couldn't use the same architecture because the repulsors operated on frequencies that interfered with the composite's runic alignment. Tony spent 2 weeks on this problem before arriving at a solution that was arguably more elegant. The suit could use Harry's magical output directly as a thrust mechanism, channeled through specifically shaped relay points in the boot assembly and lower leg panels. The math worked. The engineering worked. The question was whether Harry could sustain the output required for flight without burning through his reserves in under 3 minutes. He answered that question by quietly expanding Harry's practical training, not wand work. Tony had been clear about this from the start, because the wandless control Harry had been developing was more suited to the suit's architecture than wand-channeled magic, and because Harry's power levels were above what standard wand-focused training was built around handling. Instead, Tony had been working with Harry on directed output from the moment the wooden block test had succeeded, building up control incrementally. And over the 9 months of the build period, Harry's precision had gone from reliable at 3 feet to reliable at 20, from moving objects to moving them on specific vectors, from single object work to managing 3 separate objects simultaneously. The sustained output question, could he hold a continuous directed field for flight, was answered on a Tuesday morning in February, when Harry pushed a steady low-level field through both hands simultaneously for 4 minutes and 12 seconds before Tony called it because the frequency monitoring showed he was approaching a fatigue threshold. The expression on Harry's face when Tony called it was not exhaustion. It was focused and slightly frustrated, like someone who had been cut off mid-sentence. "Again," Harry said. "Not today," Tony said. "I've got more in reserve." "I know, I'm looking at your output log." Tony held up the tablet. "Got about 30% left before the frequency starts losing coherence. That's where I stop the test, not when you're empty. Empty is dangerous." Harry looked at the log reading. He'd learned to read the frequency monitoring display over the last several months and could interpret his own output data with reasonable accuracy. He looked at the 30% reading and then at the time stamp and did the math. "I held it for 4:12. Last Tuesday was 3:40. Up 32 seconds. What do I need for the flight system? 5 minutes minimum for low-altitude maneuvering, 7 to be safe." Tony put the tablet down. "You're not there yet. You'll get there." Harry wasn't satisfied with this, but he accepted it, which was a pattern Tony had come to recognize. Harry's threshold for accepting "not yet" was very low when the reason was genuine and the plan to get there was clear. He didn't push back on actual limitations. He pushed back on artificial ones, on people telling him no without being able to say why. 2 more weeks and Harry was at 5 minutes 45. Tony updated the boot relay specifications to account for it. The suit came together in April. Tony finished the final assembly on a Thursday night, alone in the workshop at 2 a.m. in the specific silence that accompanied the end of a long build. When the last component was in, and the system was powered but not yet calibrated, and what he had in front of him was complete but not yet alive. It sat on the stand Tony had built for it, not the Iron Man suit stand, a different one, proportioned for Harry's dimensions and designed so the suit could be put on quickly without assistance, because Harry being dependent on someone else to suit up was not acceptable, and in the workshop light it had a quality that Tony looked at for a while without trying to name. It wasn't Iron Man red and gold. The composite material had its own color, a dark burnished finish somewhere between gunmetal and iron that shifted slightly in different light, and the runic inscriptions that Babbling had laid into every panel were barely visible as surface texture until you got close enough to see them. The relay channels at the forearms, the chest core, the knee assemblies, the boot bottoms were outlined in a darker inlay that caught the light. Open-face design, as Harry had specified, with a visor that could be deployed for high-altitude or combat situations, but left the face clear by default. The JARVIS HUD interface was embedded in the visor, invisible until activated. The overall impression was nothing like an Iron Man suit. It was lighter, less visually aggressive, built around direction and precision rather than impact and force. If the Iron Man suits were built around the question of what Tony needed to survive anything, this one was built around the question of what Harry needed to be exactly as capable as he was. Tony looked at it for a long time. Then he covered it with a dust sheet and went to bed, because Harry's birthday was in 3 weeks and Tony had decided the unveiling was going to be on his birthday, and not a day before, because Harry deserved at least one thing that arrived on time and wrapped in something resembling ceremony. He slept for 6 hours, which was more than he usually managed, and when he woke up there was a message from McGonagall that said, "The Hogwarts letters go out next month. Albus will be in contact soon. I'd recommend having a position prepared." Tony sent back, "I have one." The letter arrived on Harry's birthday. This was presumably not intentional. Hogwarts letters went out to all eligible students on the same schedule regardless of what else was happening on a given date, but the timing was, Tony thought, the universe having a sense of humor. Harry's birthday was July 31st. He turned 11. Tony and Pepper had arranged a birthday breakfast that was not large or dramatically celebratory, because Harry had been quietly clear on the fact that he didn't know what to do with large celebrations. The Dursleys hadn't given him birthdays, and he'd had 4 years to develop preferences, and his preference was small, real people he actually knew. So it was Tony and Pepper and Happy and Rhodey, who had driven up from Washington specifically for this. And there was food that Harry had picked from a list Tony had given him, and a cake that was chocolate because Harry had said chocolate when Tony asked what kind without hesitating for even a second. And it was good. The owl arrived during the cake. It came through the kitchen window that JARVIS had learned to leave cracked because this was the 3rd owl in the past year and they'd established a protocol. It dropped a letter on the table next to Harry's cake plate and then sat on the back of an empty chair and looked around the room with the professional indifference of a postal worker. Harry looked at the letter, Hogwarts crest on the wax seal, his name on the front in green ink. He picked it up and looked at Tony. "I know what it is," Tony said. "Open it." Harry opened it. He read it through once, then again, then put it down on the table. Everyone at the table was looking at him with varying degrees of prepared reactions held in reserve. "Well," Harry said, "that's good timing." "Or bad timing," Happy said. "No," Harry said. "Good, I want to go." He said it simply, the way he said things he'd already thought through. "I've known for a while, the magical world is, I need to know it properly. I can't keep learning about it from books and JARVIS. "Jarvis is offended," Tony said. "I'm choosing to interpret that as a limitation of print media rather than a reflection on my teaching capabilities," Jarvis said. "You want to go," Rhodey said, looking at Harry carefully. "That's final." "Yeah." Harry looked at Tony. "Is the suit ready?" Tony looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the clock on the kitchen wall, 10:47 a.m., and said, "Come downstairs." Tony pulled the dust sheet off. Harry stood in front of the suit on the stand and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Behind them, Rhodey and Pepper and Happy had come down to the workshop and spread out along the back wall without being asked to, the way people spread out when they understand they're witnessing something. Harry stepped forward and put his hand on the chest panel. The warmth was immediate, the composite's general frequency alignment responding to proximity, and Harry felt it and his eyes changed. Not widened. Sharpened. "It's warm," Harry said. "Already responding to your field. We haven't done the calibration yet." Tony came and stood beside him. "The calibration is going to take a few hours. It's a process where the suit learns your specific frequency signature and locks the alignment to it. Once it's calibrated, it'll respond faster and more precisely." He pointed to the chest panel. "Core relay is here. That's where the primary amplification happens. The channels at your forearms and hands are for direction and precision work. Boot relays handle flight." "Flight," Harry said. "Low altitude until we've tested ceiling and duration properly. But yes, flight." Harry looked at the boot assembly, then at the open-face visor, then at Tony. "Can I put it on?" "That's the idea." The process of putting it on was designed to be fast. Tony had built the deployment mechanism specifically for independent use, the panels locking into place with a smart latch system that responded to positional alignment. Harry figured it out in under 4 minutes. The last piece, the core chest panel, clicking into place with a sound that resonated slightly differently from the rest of the assembly, a harmonic quality that the others could hear from across the room. The relay channels lit, not LEDs. The runic inlay in the relay channels activated when Harry's field connected with the composite alignment, a warm blue-white that pulsed once and then steadied. It was subtle, not theatrical, but it changed the look of the whole suit from something manufactured to something that was responding. Harry stood in the workshop with his arms slightly out from his sides, feeling it. The expression on his face was focused and inward, the way it went when he was processing something with his magic sense rather than his conventional senses. "I can feel the channels," Harry said. "It's like they're already reaching toward me, toward where the power starts." He pressed his hand to the chest panel from the outside. "This one especially." "That's the oscillator maintaining the passive alignment," Tony said. "You're feeling the system anticipating connection. When you push power through it." Harry pushed power through it. The relay channels went to full brightness, and the room's lighting flickered once in the way Tony had come to associate with significant magical output, and then stabilized, because the suit was doing exactly what it was designed to do, taking the output and giving it direction. The wooden block on the far side of the workshop, 23 feet away, the standard test distance, lifted off the table, moved in a precise arc to the left, moved back, descended to the table's surface with zero impact force. Complete precision. No lateral scatter. The power that had previously radiated outward in a pressure wave was moving in a single exact vector, stopping when Harry intended it to stop. Harry put the block down and looked at his hands. The relay channels at his forearms were faintly warm. "Oh," Harry said, "just oh, not theatrical. Just the specific recognition of something working the way it was supposed to work for the first time." "Yeah," Tony said. "I've never been able to do it that cleanly," Harry said. It went exactly where I told it to go. The channels are giving the field directionality. You've always had the precision. You just couldn't express it because the output was omnidirectional." Tony walked over and looked at the block, exactly positioned. "The suit is not doing it for you. You're doing it. The suit is just translating the intention into the vector you meant." Harry looked at the relay channels, then at Tony. "Can we do the calibration now so it learns my specific frequency? That's going to take a few hours, Tony said. It's your birthday. I'm aware. Harry looked at him. What's the birthday alternative? Cake. We have the rest of the cake. Harry appeared to weigh this for approximately 1 second. Can I have cake and then do the calibration? Yeah, Tony said. We can do both. From the back of the workshop, Rhodey, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man who had seen Tony Stark do extraordinary things for most of his adult life and had still not quite prepared for this specific iteration of it, said, Tony. Tony looked over. That, Rhodey said, is the most insane and also the most genuinely impressive thing you've ever built. Current ranking, Tony said. What's the other contender? Tony looked at Harry in the suit. Currently tied, he said. The calibration was 3 hours and 40 minutes of Harry in the suit, while JARVIS ran a sequence of output tests at progressively higher precision and frequency specificity, logging the suit's alignment response at each level, and adjusting the oscillator calibration incrementally, until the passive alignment had locked to Harry's exact frequency signature. At the end of it, when JARVIS confirmed calibration complete, the relay channels changed quality slightly. The light was the same color, but it had a different character, less like a system running a general program, and more like a system that had found the frequency it was looking for. Harry stood up from the calibration chair and Tony ran the post-calibration test, same wooden block, 30 feet this time. The block moved and stopped and moved back with the accuracy of something being carried by hand. Harry looked at the block and then at Tony. It feels different, he said. After the calibration, like it knows me. It does, in the specific sense that it's tuned to your frequency signature and will respond better to you than to anyone else. Tony made a note in the calibration log. It's also, this is going to sound unusual. Tony, Harry said, you're going to tell me something that sounds unusual, and then I'm going to find it completely normal. This has happened 47 times. 48 now. Tony looked at the monitoring display. The suit is going to get better over time. As you use it and your power develops, the composite's runic alignment will continue calibrating to match your evolving frequency signature. Babbling built it to grow with you. He paused. I thought you should know that. Harry was quiet for a moment, looking at the relay channels in his forearms, at the warm, steady glow of the core relay in his chest. It's going to change as I change. Yeah, Harry was quiet for another moment. Then, that's good engineering. It's Babbling's best work, apparently. She told me so herself. Tony saved the calibration log. She wants to see it before you take it to Hogwarts. She also said she's going to need the full output data for her research paper and she's not asking permission, she's informing me. Harry's mouth moved. The almost smile that Tony had learned to recognize as the real one, not performed, just present. I like her. She's like you. She doesn't waste time. Like me or like you? Currently unclear. Tony started closing down the monitoring setup. Give me 20 minutes to pack the data, and then we should get back upstairs. Rhodey is going to eat the rest of the cake if we leave it unattended. JARVIS, is Rhodey eating the cake? Harry asked. Colonel Rhodes has been maintaining a respectful distance from the cake for the past 2 hours. He appears to be exercising genuine discipline. JARVIS, tell him he can have a slice, Harry said. I'll let him know Mr. Potter has authorized it. Harry looked at Tony. Tony looked back. The workshop was full of the hum of systems running, the steady glow of the calibrated suit on the stand, the monitoring feeds cycling through their post-calibration settled patterns. Outside, New York was doing its full summer afternoon thing, all noise and light and motion. Happy birthday, by the way, Tony said. Officially. I meant to say it earlier and then the suit happened. It's a good birthday, Harry said. Even without the owl. Harry looked at the Hogwarts letter which was sitting on Tony's workbench because Harry had brought it down with him. Especially with the owl, he said. I want to go, I've always wanted to go. He looked at Tony. But I want to go as this, not as whatever they thought I was going to be. Tony looked at the suit, at Harry. Yeah, he said, that's why I built it. Dumbledore came on a Sunday, 2 weeks before the school term started. Tony had been expecting him and the specific timing was also expected. The Hogwarts letter had gone out, and now the formal arrangements needed to be made. And Dumbledore, Tony had come to understand, moved on a timetable that felt spontaneous but was not. He appeared on the landing pad at 10 a.m., and JARVIS announced him, and Tony told JARVIS to bring him up. This conversation was going to be different from the first one. Tony had been thinking about it since McGonagall's message, and he had a position prepared, as he'd told her. The position was clear and non-negotiable, and he'd structured it in a way that gave Dumbledore something, which was how you handled someone with genuine power and genuine intentions. You didn't just block them. You gave them a path that worked for both sides. Dumbledore came into the common room and looked at Tony and then at Harry, who was sitting in the corner of the room in his own chair, not performing casualness but genuinely relaxed, reading something with the focused stillness that was his default. The suit was in the workshop. Harry was in ordinary clothes. He looked up when Dumbledore entered and nodded, which was Harry's version of a polite greeting. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment with the same expression he'd had 4 years ago, the grief and relief tangle, less visible now but still present, and then looked at Tony. "Shall we?" Tony said, gesturing to the sitting area. They sat. Dumbledore started with the logistical framing, Hogwarts beginning September 1st, the standard arrangements, the platform information, the requirements list. He moved through it efficiently, which meant he was building towards something and wanted the preamble handled. Tony let him get through it because cutting Dumbledore off before he arrived at his actual point had not worked particularly well in the past. When Dumbledore reached the actual point, he said, "I understand you've been developing something for Harry, some kind of technological assistance for his magical practice." "A suit," Tony said. "Yes." "I'd like to understand." "No," Tony said. Dumbledore paused. "I'm not briefing you on the suit before Harry goes to Hogwarts," Tony said. "McGonagall has been briefed because she's going to be Harry's primary point of contact at the school, and she needs the operational information. But the suit's architecture is between me, Harry, and babbling, and it stays that way." Dumbledore looked at him with something that was not quite displeasure and not quite surprise. "I have concerns about the wisdom of sending an 11-year-old into an environment saturated with old magic while wearing a technological device that amplifies and directs his magical output," Harry said. Both of them looked at him. Harry had put his book down and was looking at Dumbledore with direct, level attention. "I've been working with it for 2 weeks, Harry said. "I know how it works. Tony knows how it works. JARVIS monitors it continuously. The suit doesn't make magic happen. It makes what I can already do more precise." He paused. "You're worried it's too much. That having this much capability this early is going to be a problem." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. "I am concerned," he said carefully, "with the balance of power. Hogwarts has students of many backgrounds and many levels." "Professor," Harry said, and it was the first time he'd used the title, and the specificity of it made Dumbledore pause. "I know I'm strong. I've known for a while. The suit doesn't make me stronger, it makes me more controlled." "Is controlled worse than uncontrolled?" Dumbledore considered this. "The problem," Tony said, "isn't actually the suit. The problem is that you had a plan for Harry and the suit doesn't fit the plan." He kept his voice even. "I understand the plan. Protection through Hogwarts, training in the standard curriculum, a relationship with the wizarding world that builds over time. It's a solid plan. I'm not against any of it." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "But the plan was made without accurate information about Harry's actual capabilities. Now you have accurate information. The question is whether you update the plan." Dumbledore was quiet for several seconds. The half-moon glasses caught the light and his expression was the most genuinely unmanaged Tony had seen it. He was actually thinking, not performing thinking. "If I were to ask," Dumbledore said slowly, "whether this suit is designed to protect Harry from threats he might face at Hogwarts this year, not from other students, from other threats." Tony looked at him. "What other threats?" Dumbledore met his eyes. "I believe you already know there is something at Hogwarts this year that poses a genuine danger to Harry." "I know there's a defense against the dark arts professor with a passenger," Tony said. JARVIS has been analyzing the frequency readings from Harry's visits to the Ministry over the past 2 years, and there's a frequency signature that shows up in the building every time they're in the same area that doesn't match Quirrell's baseline. Dumbledore went very still. So yes, Tony said, that's part of what the suit is for. He looked at the old man. I'm not sending him in without the ability to protect himself. That's not a negotiation. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. The old man's expression moved through several things before arriving somewhere that was resigned, maybe, or adjusted, or something in between that didn't have a clean word. You are not, Dumbledore said slowly, what I expected you to be. I know, Harry said. Is that a problem? Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. No, he said, I don't believe it is. A pause. The suit goes with you, and the condition is that Minerva has operational knowledge, and that if there is any evidence that the suit's presence is creating risk to other students, we have an immediate conversation, not after the fact. Immediately. Agreed, Harry said. Tony looked at Harry and then back at Dumbledore. The Quirrell situation, he said. What's your plan? My plan, Dumbledore said, involves certain safeguards that are already in place. The stone is protected. He paused. I had believed that the protections were sufficient. I'm now less certain of that. Because you didn't account for Harry having a suit that can interface with JARVIS remotely, Tony said. Because I didn't account for Harry being Harry, Dumbledore said. And something in his voice on that sentence was genuine in a way that most of his sentences weren't. He meant it plainly. I've been planning around a symbol for 10 years. I'm looking at a person. He stood, which was his tell for the meeting concluding. Get him to King's Cross on September 1st, Mr. Stark. Platform 9 3/4. I'll make sure the faculty is prepared. McGonagall already is, Tony said. Yes, Dumbledore said. I'm aware. And he left with the specific quality of a man who was revising something significant and doing it in motion. The Aurors came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Dumbledore's visit, 10 days before Harry was supposed to leave for Hogwarts. Tony had been expecting Malfoy to move, and the timing, after the Ministry meeting, after the Wizengamot documentation request had formally gone through and Malfoy's name had appeared in the filed documents, made complete sense. Malfoy had been patient and methodical for years, but the Wizengamot filing was a door closing that he couldn't let close. His move was legal in the specific way that Malfoy's moves always were, framed in the system's own language, using the system's own tools, aimed at an outcome the system would formally endorse while the actual purpose stayed below the surface. The legal grounds. Tony Stark, as a Muggle, had no authority under wizarding law to possess or modify magical artifacts, and specifically, had no authority to have created an item that functioned as a magical amplification device from materials that included Ministry-classified runic inscription work. The Ministry was therefore within its rights to confiscate the artifact pending review of whether it constituted a violation of the Statute of Secrecy and international magical trade regulations. The actual intent: get the suit out of Harry's hands before September 1st. Tony had seen the Ministry communication about the pending action 3 days before it happened, because JARVIS was still inside the Ministry's communication system and had flagged the filing as soon as it was entered. He'd had 3 days to prepare, which was enough. When the Aurors arrived, 4 of them, professional and polite in the way that people with legal authority didn't need to be threatening, Tony let them in. Pepper had been briefed. JARVIS had been briefed. Happy was downstairs. Tony had called a specific journalist from the Times that morning and established a background conversation that was currently, technically, still ongoing through a phone left on speaker in the study. The Aurors came into the lobby and presented the confiscation order. Tony read it, which took 2 minutes, and then said, "Let me show you to the workshop." He walked them to the workshop level. He opened the workshop door. Harry was standing in the center of the workshop in the full suit. The relay channels were running at steady baseline. No active output, just the passive alignment. The warm blue-white glow at the forearms and chest and knee assemblies. Harry was 11 years old. He stood in the center of Tony's workshop with his arms loose at his sides and his face completely neutral, and the suit's glow steady around him, and he did not move when the Aurors came through the door. The lead Auror, a senior operative named Robards who had been doing this for 20 years, stopped in the doorway. The three others stacked up behind him. They looked at Harry and at the suit, and at the relay channels running their steady soft light, and nobody said anything for about 4 seconds. "I'm Harry Potter," Harry said, into the silence. His voice was level and clear. "I'm 11 years old, and I'll be attending Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry on September 1st, where Headmaster Albus Dumbledore has agreed to permit me to bring this suit as part of my educational arrangements." He paused. "The suit was built for me, using composite materials developed with Rune Master Bathsheba Babbling, who holds a current teaching position at Hogwarts, and who is available to verify the materials and inscription methodology." Another pause. "I'm happy to answer any technical questions about the suit's construction, but I'm not taking it off." Robards looked at him, then at Tony. Tony was standing to Harry's left and behind him, which was deliberate positioning, Harry forward, Tony available but not leading. He met Robards' eyes and said nothing, because Harry had handled the opening, and Tony breaking in immediately would undercut that. "The confiscation order," Robards said slowly, "covers the artifact currently, described as a Muggle-constructed magical amplification device," Harry said. "I've read the order." He looked at the senior Auror with the steady, unblinking attention he brought to things he was serious about. "Suit is not a Muggle-constructed device. It's a composite of Muggle engineering and wizarding runic craftsmanship. Runemaster Babbling is a qualified practitioner with ministry recognition. Her inscription work on the suit constitutes a wizarding magical process. That makes this a magical artifact produced through legitimate magical practice, not a Muggle artifact." He paused. "Which means the statute of secrecy grounds for the confiscation order don't apply." Robards opened his mouth. Harry wasn't done. "If the Ministry's position is that Muggle engineering partnered with wizarding inscription work creates a regulatory ambiguity, that's a genuine question for the Wisengamot to clarify, and I'd welcome that review." Harry's tone was not aggressive. It was the tone of someone making a reasonable argument, clear and direct. "But a confiscation pending that review requires evidence that the current possession constitutes an active danger to the statute of secrecy or to the public. I'm in a private building with no Muggles present except Tony Stark, who is already aware of the wizarding world and is operating under existing ministry confidentiality protocols." Another pause. "What active danger does my having the suit pose right now specifically?" Robards stared at him. The Auror to Robards' left, a younger operative, had been watching Harry with an expression that had gradually shifted from professional to something more genuine. She was looking at him the way you looked at something unexpected. Tony said, quietly, "JARVIS, share the Babbling credentials file with the Auror team's secure documents portal." "Already done," JARVIS said. "I also took the liberty of forwarding the relevant section of the Hogwarts agreement to their department head's office." Robards looked at the ceiling where JARVIS's voice had come from, then at Tony, then at Harry. "The order specifies," he began. "The order was filed by Lucius Malfoy's legal counsel," Tony said, calm and clear, "which is a matter of record in the ministry documents that were filed with the Wisengamot last month, the same filing that includes documentation of Mr. Malfoy's involvement in the original containment action against Harry when Harry was 4 years old." Tony looked at Robards evenly. "I want to make sure you have the full context of what you're being asked to execute here. I'm not saying don't do your job. I'm saying make sure you know whose errand this is before you do it." Robards was quiet for a long moment. He was a career Auror, not a politician, and Tony watched him work through it with the specific quality of a man who was genuinely professional running an honest assessment of the situation. "I need to consult with the department head," Robards said finally. "Of course," Tony said. "Can I offer anyone tea while you do that?" The senior Auror gave him a flat look. He took out something that was not quite a phone and moved to the corner of the room. Harry watched him with the same neutral expression, and then turned his head slightly toward Tony. Tony gave the smallest nod. Harry had read the situation correctly, had made the argument cleanly, and now the right move was to wait while Robards navigated his institutional reality. The consultation took 12 minutes. During those 12 minutes, Harry stood in the suit without moving significantly, and Tony leaned against his workbench in JARVIS, provided quiet real-time updates through Tony's earpiece on what JARVIS could observe of the ministry's internal communication traffic, which indicated that Robards had reached the department head, and the department head was making calls, and at least 2 of those calls had gone to Wisengamot members who were on the oversight committee that had received the Malfoy documentation. The network effect. Malfoy had deep ministry connections, but the Wisengamot was not the ministry, and the members on the oversight committee had been sitting with the documentation for 3 weeks and had questions of their own. Robards came back. He looked at Harry. He looked at Tony. "The department has determined," he said carefully, "that the current confiscation order is insufficient in its grounds given the regulatory ambiguity identified in Mr. Potter's legal argument." A pause. "Formal clarification of the applicable regulatory framework will be sought from the Wisengamot. In the interim, the order is suspended pending that review." Another pause. "We'll be going." "Thank you," Harry said, "for coming and for consulting." Robards looked at him for a moment. Something moved through his expression that might have been respect but was too controlled to fully identify. Then he turned and left, and his team followed, and the workshop door closed. Tony waited 5 seconds. Then he looked at Harry. Harry was looking at the workshop door with an expression that had come down slightly from the focused neutrality of the last 20 minutes, and underneath it was the after-feeling of sustained performance, not exhaustion, but the release that came when you could stop holding a particular configuration. "Malfoy's going to file again," Harry said. "Yeah," Tony said, "but not before September 1st. He can't move the Wisengamot review any faster than it moves on its own." He pushed off from the workbench, "which means we have 10 days, and Malfoy just publicly connected himself to a legal action against an 11-year-old school supplies, which is going to look great when the review committee reads it alongside the 4-year-old in chains documents." Harry looked at him. "You planned the timing." "I knew he'd file. I knew when." The 10-day window before school was the most valuable time for him to act, so it was the time I needed to be ready for. Tony looked at the suit. "Nice argument, by the way. The wizarding muggle composite angle." "You thought of it," Harry said. "The night babbling confirmed the material." "You were listening." "I'm always listening." "I know," Tony looked at him. "You were good in there, you were precise, and you didn't give them anything to push against." He paused. "The bit about the active danger, that was yours." "The argument requires a specific threat to justify immediate confiscation," Harry said. "There wasn't one. If there's no specific threat, the grounds collapse." He paused. "You taught me to look for the structural weakness in the other person's position. I taught you that. You do it constantly. Every meeting I've watched you in, you find the thing their argument requires to be true and you check if it's actually true." Harry looked at the relay channels in his forearms, which had stayed at their steady baseline throughout the entire Auror confrontation. "The suit didn't flicker," he said. "Number the whole time. Even when I was," he stopped. "I was holding it. The channels registered it, but they held the direction." "Controlled output," Tony said. "That's what the suit does." Harry looked at his hands. Then at Tony. "I was scared," he said. "Flat and direct, no performance around it in either direction. Just a fact about himself that he was stating because it was true and worth saying. When they came through the door, for a second, I know, it didn't stop me from thinking clearly." "No," Tony said. "It didn't." Harry nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod he used when he was filing something as confirmed and settled. Then he began taking the suit off, moving through the deployment sequence in reverse with the fluency of someone who had been practicing it for 3 weeks. Tony came and held the chest panel while Harry detached it, the way he'd been doing since the first calibration. And when the last component came off, Harry stood in ordinary clothes again, and the relay channels went dark on the stand. Tony put the chest panel on its storage cradle and looked at it for a moment. The runic inscription was barely visible at rest. just a texture in the material, nothing that would read as significant if you didn't know what you were looking at. He thought about the night in Surrey, about 45 seconds on a padlock and the decision to open a door because there was a door and he'd heard a sound. The math being simple. He'd said that to Harry and he'd meant it and he still meant it, but the math had kept unfolding from that original simple equation into something much more complex, and he had no regrets about any of it, which was the only math that actually mattered at 2 a.m. when the accounting came due. "Tony," Harry said. Tony looked at him. "Thank you." He said it the way he said most things, direct, no decoration. "For the suit, not just for building it right." Tony looked at him for a moment. 11 years old, about to go to Hogwarts, already someone that grown adults had to revise their plans around. "It's good engineering," Tony said. "It's more than that." "Yeah," Tony said. "It is." He picked up the next item on his workbench and went back to work, because that was how Tony Stark handled moments that were too real to sit inside for too long. And Harry settled onto the stool across from him and picked up his book, and they stayed in the workshop for another 2 hours in the comfortable parallel silence that had been their working mode for 3 years. That night, very late, Tony was reviewing the Auror interaction logs when Jarvis said, "Mr. Stark." An incoming signal through the magical communication relay, untraceable origin through 17 different relay points. Tony straightened. "Content, 3 words. Jarvis put it on screen. "He is ready." Tony looked at it. He'd seen the Ministry communication logs, the Malfoy documents, the Quirrell frequency data, and the Wisengamot filings, and he'd built the suit around a clear and specific understanding of the threats in front of them. He had a model of the problem, and it was a good model, and he'd been operating on it for 2 years. This message didn't fit the model. The routing was more sophisticated than anything the Ministry or Malfoy used. The 3-word construction was not Ministry bureaucratic language and not Malfoy's style. Malfoy communicated in legal frameworks and political implications, not 3-word declarations. "Signature on the message," Tony said. "What's the magical frequency signature?" "Cold," Jarvis said, and there was something in the AI's voice that was the closest it got to uncertainty. "Older than anything in our database. It has partial matches, but only one consistent partial match. The closest matching signature in our entire 4 years of logged data is the trace signature we recorded from Harry's scar during the early incident monitoring." Tony sat very still. "Not Quirrell," Tony said. "Not the Quirrell passenger frequency I have logged. Number this is deeper, older. The Quirrell signature is like a signal transmitted through a medium. This is more like the source of that signal." Tony looked at the screen for a long moment. The 3 words sat there, simple and absolute. "He is ready." Tony got up and went to Harry's room and stood in the doorway. Harry was asleep. The room was still. The suit was downstairs on its stand, glowing faintly at the relay points in the dark workshop, calibrated and ready. Tony stood there for a moment and then went back to his desk and opened a new communication to McGonagall. He typed, "Dumbledore, the stone protection. Is it enough?" Her response came in 8 minutes. "Albus believes so, I'm less certain." Tony typed, "I need you to be less certain," out loud to him. "Tomorrow." A longer pause, then, "Understood." Tony looked at the message on screen. He is ready. He was going to send Harry to Hogwarts in 10 days. That was not changing. The suit was ready. Jarvis would be remotely accessible. McGonagall was prepared, and Harry was. Harry had stood in a room of Aurors and made an airtight legal argument while scared and had not broken composure for a second. Harry was ready. The question the message raised was, ready for what exactly and said by whom? Tony stared at the trace signature data that Jarvis had mapped against the scar frequency reading from 3 years ago. It was a partial match. Not the thing itself, but something that knew the thing. Something that had been watching, the way Malfoy had been watching, but from further back and deeper in. He added it to the model and looked at the new shape of the problem. Then he started drafting an updated suit firmware for Jarvis to run during the Hogwarts period, expanded threat signature library, enhanced proximity detection, a flag protocol for the specific cold old frequency he just logged. He worked until 4 a.m., and then he stopped and went to bed because Harry needed him functional in the morning, and being functional required occasionally sleeping. He was asleep inside 5 minutes, which was the specific privilege of someone who could compartmentalize well and who had done everything they could do with the current information. There would be more information soon. There always was. Tony Stark was extremely good at keeping up. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Hogwarts. In the First War, the Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at exactly 11 in the morning, and Harry Potter was on it, which meant Tony Stark was standing on platform 9 3/4 at 10:47 a.m. watching a steam engine that should not exist in 1991 and feeling something he was choosing not to name. Pepper was there. Happy was there. Rhodey had sent a message at 7 a.m. that said, "Good luck, kid. Give him hell," and Harry had read it twice and folded it into his jacket pocket. McGonagall had confirmed via the relay system that she'd be on the platform to meet students as they arrived. Dumbledore had sent a brief message the night before that said the staff was prepared and contained enough warm gravitas that Tony had read it and put it down and gone back to triple-checking Harry's suit storage case. The suit was in a modified trunk, not magically modified, structurally modified by Tony, with a biometric lock, a secondary electromagnetic seal that would require Harry's specific frequency signature to open from the outside, and a JARVIS-connected internal monitoring system that would run passive diagnostics and flag any tampering. The trunk also contained Harry's textbooks, his school supplies from the list Hogwarts had sent, 3 changes of casual clothes that actually fit, and a small notebook that Tony had left in there without telling Harry about, filled with his own notes on the suit's calibration data, the frequency monitoring logs, and a technical reference section that Harry could use if something happened, and he needed to troubleshoot without Tony on the line. He'd written on the inside cover, "If something breaks, start at the chest relay. It's always the chest relay. Underneath that, call me first. Before you do anything, call." Harry had found the notebook that morning when he was packing, had read both lines, and had come out to the kitchen and said nothing about it. He just sat down and eaten breakfast with the focused, ordinary presence he brought to things that mattered, and Tony had sat across from him and also said nothing, and that had been its own kind of conversation. Now they were on the platform and the train was there, and the 10:53 mark was approaching, and Harry had the trunk on a trolley and his school robes on over his regular clothes, because the suit's relay points at the collar and wrists were just barely visible, and the robes covered them cleanly. He looked like a student. He looked like every other first year on the platform, the same mix of excited and nervous, and trying not to show either. Except that he didn't, quite. Tony watched him and saw the difference that 4 years made. Harry stood with a particular quality of ease, the not-performance of someone who was comfortable in themselves, and he watched the platform with the steady read-everything attention that was so built into him now it looked like a personality trait rather than a learned behavior. JARVIS is going to run the passive monitoring on a 2-hour check-in cycle, Tony said. You can initiate contact at any point through the Stark phone. I know you can't use it in class. Put it in your trunk when you're not using it. I know, Harry said. The suit's monitoring will flag anything in the threat signature library. Quirrell especially. If the proximity reading spikes, you move away first and ask questions second. I know. The Hogwarts interference is real, but JARVIS has been calibrating the signal routing around it for 3 weeks. There may be areas of the castle where the connection is degraded. The dungeons, possibly the astronomy tower. If you lose JARVIS, I run the manual diagnostics from the notebook and I call you, Harry said. He was looking at Tony with an expression that was patient and present and slightly amused in the way of someone who had been listening carefully and was now demonstrating that they had done so. I have the notebook, I have the phone, the suit is calibrated and I know how to troubleshoot it. McGonagall knows the full operational specs. Dumbledore knows the threat signature we're watching for. He paused. I'm ready. I know you're ready. Then why are we going through the list again? Tony looked at him. Harry looked back. The train whistle sounded the first boarding signal, and around them the platform went into motion. Children and parents and luggage and owls in cages moving toward the cars. "Habit," Tony said. Harry looked at him for a moment longer. Then he stepped forward, and it was brief, and Harry wasn't demonstrative. This was not a Harry trait. He pressed his forehead briefly against Tony's shoulder the way a person did when they were 11 and had spent 4 years learning that physical contact was not a weapon. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then Harry stepped back and picked up his trolley handle. "I'll call tonight," Harry said. "Yeah," Tony said. "You will." Pepper hugged Harry, which he accepted with the slightly stiff warmth of someone who was getting better at accepting physical affection and wasn't there yet. Happy shook his hand very seriously, which was exactly the right call for Harry, and Harry shook back with equal seriousness. McGonagall appeared at Tony's elbow from somewhere. The woman moved with the silent efficiency of someone who had been navigating busy school environments for 40 years, and gave Harry a nod that contained approximately 40 different things, all of them supportive without being sentimental, which was the exact register Harry responded to best. "Welcome to Hogwarts, Mr. Potter," she said. "I'll see you at the feast." Harry nodded back with the same density of unstated things and got on the train. Tony watched the train. He watched it until it was fully out of the station and the platform had thinned to the last few families still gathered at the far end, and then he watched the empty track for about 30 seconds after that. Pepper appeared beside him. She didn't say anything. She was excellent at this. "Okay," Tony said eventually. "Okay," Pepper said. "I need coffee and I need to check the monitoring feed, and then I need to do about 6 hours of actual Stark Industries work that I have been deprioritizing." "I know. I've been managing the backlog." "I know you have." Tony turned from the empty track. "He's fine." "He's absolutely fine," Pepper said with complete certainty. "He handled the oars better than most of my legal team would have." "He's your kid," Pepper said, simple and plain, and didn't elaborate, and Tony nodded once and walked toward the platform exit, and that was that. The Hogwarts Express took 7 hours, and Harry spent the first 2 of them in a compartment on his own, which was deliberate. He'd gotten on the train early and found an empty one and settled in with a book, because the platform had been loud and stimulating, and he needed the transition time before arriving somewhere new. He was 40 pages into a textbook on the theory of spell casting, interesting for the physics of it, the way magical force interacted with intent at a mechanical level, which was a question the book addressed in a way that made him want to annotate every 3rd paragraph, when the compartment door slid open and a boy with red hair and a smear of something on his nose looked in. "Everywhere else is full," the boy said. "Can I sit here?" Harry looked at him. Direct, open face, the specific kind of cheerful that came from growing up surrounded by people who liked you. "Yeah," Harry said. The boy sat down across from him and immediately tried to do a spell with a broken wand that didn't work, and said his name was Ron, and had 5 brothers and a sister, and his family was pure blood. The last piece offered with a slight self-consciousness that suggested he'd gotten into arguments about it before or expected to. Harry told him his name and watched Ron's face go through the recognition sequence that everyone's face went through, the scar, the name, the boy who lived calculation, and waited for whatever came after. What came after was Ron saying, "Are those real?" and pointing at the relay points visible at Harry's collar above the robe neckline. Harry looked down at his collar. He'd thought the robes were covering them. They weren't quite. The slight luminescence of the passive alignment was catching the light through the fabric gap at the top button. "Yeah," Harry said. "My guardian built them. It's complicated." "What do they do?" "Help direct magical output, control and precision." Harry looked at Ron's expression. "They look weird." "They look really interesting, actually," Ron said, with the honesty of someone who didn't have the social reflex yet to moderate genuine interest. "My dad loves Muggle stuff. He'd go absolutely mental for that." He paused. "Your guardian is a Muggle, Tony Stark." Ron stared at him. "The Iron Man Tony Stark. That one. Guardian is Tony Stark." "Yes." Ron appeared to process this for a moment. "Does he know about magic?" He built the relay system, so yes. Ron looked at the relay points again, then at Harry, then apparently decided this was the most interesting first day of school information he was ever going to get and settled back in his seat with an expression of someone who had made a decision about a person. "I'm going to have so many questions for you," he said. "Okay," Harry said. "Not right now. Just later a lot, that's fine." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, Ron eating something that turned out to be every flavor beans with the brave methodology of someone who had done this before and knew the risks, Harry going back to his textbook. Ron asked a question every 10 minutes or so, not pestering, just genuinely curious in an open and unself-conscious way that Harry found easy to handle, and Harry answered each one. At the 3-hour mark, a girl with a lot of brown hair and a precise, prepared manner arrived in the doorway and informed them that there was something on Ron's nose. Ron said he knew, and she said it looked like dirt, and Ron said it was chocolate, and she introduced herself as Hermione Granger and said she'd already memorized all the first-year textbooks and asked if either of them had performed any of the spells yet. Harry said, "I don't use a wand. The relay system channels it differently." Hermione looked at the relay points at his collar, then at his face, then at the relay points again. "How does that work mechanically? Is the runic inscription creating a directional field that—" "Essentially," Harry said. "It's more complex than that, but that's the framework." Hermione sat down next to Ron without asking, because she was clearly in a situation that interested her enough to override social convention. "Who designed the runic inscription?" "A woman named Bathsheba Babbling. She teaches ancient runes at Hogwarts." "I know who she is. She's written 3 foundational papers on practical runic inscription methodology." Hermione looked at Harry with the expression of someone recalibrating rapidly. "She designed this specifically for you. In collaboration with my guardian." "Who is?" "Tony Stark," Ron said, with the satisfied tone of someone who had gotten to this information first. Hermione's expression did several things very quickly. "Tony Stark, the engineer, the Iron Man, the one who works in—" "That one," Harry confirmed. Hermione looked at the relay points for another moment. Then she pulled out a textbook and opened it with the specific energy of someone who has just encountered something they want to understand properly and is going to approach it systematically. "Can I ask you technical questions about how it interacts with standard spell casting theory? I've been reading about magical output directionality, and the textbooks are very vague on the underlying mechanics." "Sure," Harry said. They talked for an hour and a half. Ron eventually fell asleep in the middle of a sentence about his brother Charlie and dragons, which was very Ron, and Harry and Hermione talked through the mechanical theory of magical directionality, with the collaborative focus of 2 people who had found someone operating at a compatible intellectual frequency. Hermione knew the wizarding theoretical framework in depth. Harry knew the physics and engineering from 4 years of JARVIS and Tone. The overlap between the two produced several genuinely interesting observations that neither of them had reached alone, and Hermione filled 2 pages of notes and then looked at her filled pages and then at Harry with an expression that was recognition. "You think about it the same way I do," she said. "The same way who does?" Harry asked. "As a system," Hermione said. "Most people in the wizarding world approach magic like it's categorical. This spell does this. That spell does that. You think about the underlying mechanics." She paused. "I've been doing that since I got my letter, and everyone at home thinks I'm being overly academic about it." "The mechanics are what make it work," Harry said. "If you don't understand why it works, you can't predict when it won't." Hermione wrote that down, which Harry noted and found slightly surprising and also entirely understandable. Ron woke up as the train was slowing toward Hogsmeade Station, looked at Harry's and Hermione's notes with the expression of someone who had missed something significant, and asked if he could read the notes later. Harry said yes. Hermione said she'd make a clean copy. Ron appeared satisfied with this despite clearly not having expected it. Harry looked out the window as the train came into the station, and saw the first lights of Hogsmeade, and beyond them up on the hill, Hogwarts Castle lit against the dark sky. He'd seen photographs. McGonagall had sent several practical ones with notes on the layout and the faculty office locations. Tony had pulled satellite imagery and cross-referenced it with the historical architectural plans that existed in Magical World archives, which JARVIS had accessed and mapped. Harry had a floor plan memorized and a mental model of the castle's magical field density based on 3 months of JARVIS signal calibration work. None of that had prepared him for what it actually looked like against the dark, all lit windows and towers and the moving quality of magic-saturated ancient stone, like something that had been alive long enough to have its own weight. "First time seeing it," Ron said, watching Harry's face. "Yeah," Harry said. "It's brilliant, right?" "Yeah," Harry said. "It is." The boats across the lake were handled by a man the size of a small house named Hagrid, who had been waiting at the station, and whose voice and energy reminded Harry of a force of nature that had been given the shape of a person, and had decided to be very cheerful about it. Hagrid looked at Harry with a specific warmth that had something else underneath it, grief or memory or both, and said, "All rig, Harry," with the careful gentleness of someone who had been waiting to ask this for a long time. "Yeah," Harry said. "Are you all right?" Hagrid blinked at being asked back like he hadn't expected it, and then his massive face broke into a grin and he said he was absolutely brilliant, thanks for asking, and directed the first years to the boats. Harry shared a boat with Ron and Hermione, and a round-faced boy named Neville who had already lost his toad twice since the station, and was cradling it in both hands with the focused care of someone managing a situation. Hermione had helped him find it the second time, in the boat 2 over, and Neville had the look of someone who had decided Hermione was a fixed positive in a somewhat overwhelming world. Harry watched the castle come closer across the lake and ran a quiet systems check through the suit's passive connection, the way he'd been doing every few hours since the calibration. The relay channels registered steady. The core relay was holding alignment through the Hogwarts interference. There was interference. Tony had been right. A low-level frequency noise from the castle's saturated old magic that was like trying to tune a radio near a powerful transmitter. But JARVIS had done the calibration work, and the suit's alignment was holding clear above it. JARVIS was quieter than usual, the connection noticeably thinner than in Stark Tower, but present. Harry had the earpiece in his left ear, small enough not to be visible, and JARVIS was running a passive monitoring feed at reduced fidelity, flagging the most significant threat signature reads and otherwise staying quiet to conserve signal quality. Threat signature library running at 73% capacity due to interference, JARVIS said quietly as the boats pulled toward the castle entrance. The Quirrell target signature is loaded and active. I'll flag any match above threshold. Harry didn't respond because Neville was 2 feet away and asking Ron about the sorting process, and it would have been a strange time to speak into apparently empty air. He just registered it and kept watching the castle. The entrance hall was everything the photographs hadn't captured: scale, and the specific quality of old magic in stone, and 100 children from 1st to 7th year who had not been in Harry's photographs, and who were currently experiencing the collective shock of returning students plus the general castle presence, which ran at a frequency that Harry's suit registered as a broad harmonic overtone across the entire Hogwarts magical field. The first years were herded to an antechamber off the entrance hall. McGonagall appeared, precisely as she had been on Tony's landing pad, hat, robes, expression that mixed warmth and authority in a ratio she'd clearly been calibrating for 40 years. She gave them the briefing about the houses and the sorting and the expectations of conduct, and Harry stood in the group and listened and watched. Draco Malfoy was 3 people to his left. Harry had seen photographs of Lucius from the Ministry atrium. The resemblance was sufficient that the identification was immediate. Same blonde hair, same sharp features, same quality of assessment in the eyes. Draco was looking at Harry with the specific expression of someone who had been briefed on this person extensively and was currently comparing the briefing to the reality and finding the reality either more or less than expected. Harry met his eyes for exactly 1 second, registered the assessment, and looked back at McGonagall. The The sorting was in the Great Hall, which was a lot. The ceiling was the sky, or looked like it, and 4 long house tables ran the length of the hall with the upper years already seated, and 1,000 candles floated overhead. And when 140 students from 7 years looked up to see who was being sorted, the collective weight of that attention was something Harry had not fully modeled even with the photographs. The sorting hat was old and patched, and it started singing, and the song was about the houses and their qualities, and Harry listened to it and filed the information. Then the first names were called, and students sat on the stool and put on the hat, and the hat shouted a house name. And it was simple enough except that Harry was watching the reactions, the house tables, the other students, the faculty line, and calibrating the room the whole time. When McGonagall called Potter Harry, the Great Hall's noise, which had been a continuous low undercurrent, went fully silent. Harry walked to the stool. He sat down. McGonagall placed the hat on his head, and it dropped over his eyes. It was not silent inside the hat. "Well," said a voice that was inside his head and outside his head simultaneously, dry and ancient and amused in the way of something very old that had seen a lot and still found things interesting. "Interesting. Very interesting. I haven't had one like this in quite some time. Where do you usually put people like me?" Harry thought direct. That's the question, isn't it? The hat seemed to examine him the way a person examines something through a magnifying glass, slow and thorough. The courage is real, not performed, not hoped for, genuinely present. Gryffindor would say yes immediately. A pause, but look at this. The ambition, the strategic thinking, the understanding that information is power and patience is a tool, the willingness to play a long game. Slytherin would be very interested in you. I'm not interested in Slytherin, no. The hat seemed to consider this. That's itself an interesting answer. Not Slytherin is bad or I don't want to be with those people. Just not interested. Why? Because the long game Slytherin plays is about self-preservation and power consolidation. I'm not interested in either of those as ends. Harry kept his thinking clear and directed because this was an examination and he understood examinations. I'm interested in what I can do and whether I can do it well and who I can protect while I'm doing it. That's not a Slytherin motivation. No, the hat agreed slowly. That's rather more Gryffindor than it appears from the outside. Another pause. You're also quite unusual in other ways. The device you're wearing, the education you've had, the people who have shaped you. You're going to be unlike any student I've ever sorted, Mr. Potter. Not everyone will be comfortable with that. I know. And that's their problem, Harry thought. I'm comfortable with it. The hat made a sound that might have been a laugh if hats could laugh. Yes, I thought so. Better be Gryffindor. The hat was lifted from his head, and the Gryffindor table exploded with noise in the way that only Gryffindor's particular brand of enthusiasm could produce. And Harry walked to the table and sat down, and the noise moved on to the next name on the list. Ron landed in Gryffindor 2 names later and dropped into the seat across from Harry with the satisfied expression of someone whose outcome had been inevitable from the start. Hermione Granger, called before Ron, had been sorted in under 10 seconds. The hat had barely touched her head and was already seated further down the table. At the faculty table, Professor Quirrell sat between 2 other professors and smiled vaguely at the room. Harry looked at him. The suit's proximity monitoring was running. At the distance of the Great Hall's length, the Quirrell frequency read was too low for JARVIS to flag within threshold. Harry noted it and turned his attention back to the sorting. The feast was Hogwarts doing what Hogwarts apparently did with food, which was to make it appear and make it real, and make it a quantity that suggested the castle's idea of appropriate portions was calibrated for people 3 times the size of the average student. Ron ate with the commitment of someone conducting important research. Hermione appeared further down the table and found a seat near Harry, and immediately began a conversation with a second-year girl about the defense against the dark arts curriculum that was clearly already more interesting to her than the food. Harry ate and listened to the table and observed. The Gryffindors were a particular kind of people, he was finding. Loud in a way that was mostly good-natured, quick to react, quick to connect, and fundamentally generous in a way that was baked in rather than performed. An older boy who introduced himself as Percy, very formally, as a fifth-year prefect, and then talked for 4 minutes about the rules and regulations in a way that made Ron's eyes glaze, but that Harry actually found mildly interesting because rules and their structures were useful information. Twin boys in the year above, introduced as Fred and George, who tested the boundary of every visible social expectation with the specific cheerful energy of people who had found that their optimum operating mode was right at the edge of trouble. Harry answered questions when asked, was direct without being abrasive, and did not perform anything. He said he was from New York, said his guardian was Tony Stark when it came up, handled the various stages of people processing that information, the disbelief, the recalibration, the curious follow-up questions, with even-handed patience, and noticed that the relay points visible at his collar attracted looks from several people which he acknowledged and moved past. After the feast, Dumbledore spoke. He was warm, slightly eccentric in the delivery, and then at the end he said, clear and direct, "The third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death." He said it with the same mild pleasantness he'd used for everything else. Ron looked at Harry. Harry looked at the third-floor corridor direction. He already knew what was on the third floor. The stone, Dumbledore's additional safeguards, Quirrell, who was a problem on legs, sitting 15 feet away at the faculty table. Harry made a note. "I'm logging the third-floor location reference," Jarvis said quietly in his ear. "Recommend mapping the route during tomorrow's initial castle navigation." Harry didn't respond visibly. He picked up a glass of pumpkin juice and drank it and watched Quirrell make polite conversation with the Transfiguration professor beside him, and the suit's monitoring registered nothing at this distance except the low ambient read of someone with an anomalous magical signature. The first week of Hogwarts was a process of calibration. The castle's magical field was denser and more varied than any environment Harry had been in, and the suit was working continuously to maintain its alignment through the interference. Jarvis had built the signal routing around 3 weeks of pre-arrival calibration, and the suit held well in most areas, the classrooms, the corridors, the Great Hall, the grounds. But there were nodes where the old castle magic created enough disruption to degrade the relay connection noticeably. The dungeons were the worst, the potions classroom specifically, where the combination of hundreds of years of potion making and the underlying stone architecture produced a frequency environment that Jarvis described as aggressively complicated. "I can work with it," Harry said, testing the relay channels in the potions corridor before his first class. The chest relay was running at slightly reduced fidelity, not compromised, but the precision feedback was fuzzier than in open air. "I'd recommend keeping active output conservative in this area until I've mapped the interference pattern more fully. The directionality is less predictable here." "Noted." Harry pulled his robe straight and went into potions. Professor Snape was a different kind of problem. He had the specific quality of someone who had decided something about Harry before Harry walked through the door, and the decision was not positive. And Snape was not the kind of person who would revise it because the evidence didn't support it. He asked Harry 3 questions in the first 5 minutes of class, the tone suggesting he expected no correct answer, and Harry gave 3 correct answers in the same calm register he gave everything, and Snape's expression went somewhere that was less hostile and more assessing, like a switch had been flipped from one mode of unpleasantness to a different mode. The relay points at Harry's collar made Snape pause for one clearly visible second. "What are those?" Snape asked. "Relay channels for magical field direction," Harry said. "Part of a suit I wear. Professor McGonagall has the technical documentation if you need it." Snape looked at him for a long moment. "You won't be wearing them in this classroom." "I'll need to check the operational parameters with Professor McGonagall," Harry said. "The suit isn't optional in the way that accessories are. She can clarify." He paused, keeping his voice completely even. I don't want to be difficult about it, I just need to follow the process we agreed. Snape's eyes narrowed. The class was watching. Harry held the eye contact steadily, not aggressively, just present. We will discuss it with McGonagall, Snape said, and turned back to the blackboard, and that was the last Harry heard of it in that class. Ron, 2 seats over, made a face at Harry that communicated. That went better than expected. Harry looked back. I know. Ron appeared satisfied with this silent exchange. Hermione, 1 seat over from Harry, had been watching the interaction with the focused attention of someone conducting research, and had clearly formed several opinions that she was currently organizing into a mental list. Defense against the dark arts was its own specific experience. Quirrell met them on Tuesday morning, and Harry walked into the classroom with the suit's Quirrell signature protocol running at heightened sensitivity. From the doorway, before he even fully entered the room, JARVIS flagged it. Quirrell proximity match initiating. The surface signature is present. The secondary signature, the passenger, is present and registering above threshold, recommending elevated awareness. Harry took a seat in the middle of the room, not at the front, where Hermione was settling with her notebook, and not at the back, but in the middle, where the sightlines to the door and the teacher's desk were both good. He kept his posture easy and his expression ordinary. Quirrell was wearing a purple turban and smiling vaguely at the class and was genuinely, visibly nervous. His hands moved when he talked. He repeated himself. He apologized for repeating himself. The surface performance was of a mild and somewhat ineffectual man who had had a frightening experience with vampires on a study trip and had not quite recovered. The secondary signature under it was nothing like that. Harry did not look at Quirrell more than a new student would look at a new teacher. He took the notes that were worth taking and asked one question that was genuinely useful and said nothing else. The suit's monitoring ran continuous throughout the class. When class ended and the students filed out, Quirrell stopped Harry. "Mr. Potter," he said, not nervous. The nervousness was a costume, and when he forgot to wear it, it showed. "I understand you had an unusual upbringing, outside our world." "I grew up in New York," Harry said. He was standing by the door with his bag over his shoulder, not blocking it but not moving away from it either, "with my guardian. And the device you're wearing." Quirrell's eyes moved to the collar where the relay points were. "Quite remarkable, a Muggle construction, a collaboration," Harry said. "My guardian is Tony Stark. He worked with Runemaster babbling on the inscription work." Something moved through Quirrell's face, not the vague nervousness. Something underneath that. Calculating. "Fascinating," Quirrell said. His voice had a specific quality of wanting to ask more while not wanting to appear to want to ask more. The suit's secondary signature read spiked. "Recommend concluding this interaction," JARVIS said in Harry's ear. "The passenger signature has elevated significantly in the last 30 seconds. This is consistent with the source being actively interested in what you just said." "I should get to my next class," Harry said. "Still even, still easy." "It was a good lesson, Professor. I'm looking forward to the practical component." He went through the door at a pace that was unhurried and did not look rushed. In the corridor, he walked for 30 seconds and then stepped into a window alcove and stood there for a moment. "His primary interest escalated when you mentioned babbling," JARVIS said, "specifically the runic inscription component. The passenger's pattern suggests the relay architecture is meaningful to it in a way that goes beyond general curiosity." Harry stood in the alcove and thought about this. The suit's runic inscription was designed to amplify and direct his magical output, the opposite of what the chain had been designed to do. Something that had wanted him suppressed, something connected to the frequency signature on the chains, would naturally be interested in a device that had inverted that suppression. He went straight to the owlery. Tony's response came back before dinner. "Noted. Good. Keep logging. Don't engage further unless you have to. The passenger's interest in the suit means it's reading the frequency data from close proximity, meaning Voldemort can probably detect how your power is developing through the suit's active emissions. I'm going to adjust the passive emission profile tonight to mask the amplitude data. You'll feel a slight change in the core relay warmth. Normal. Don't panic. Harry read this twice, then added, the interest spiked specifically when I mentioned babbling and the runic inscription work. Tony's reply was fast. Interesting. I'll think about why. Good work today. Harry folded the note and put it in his trunk next to the notebook. Draco Malfoy found Harry in a corridor on the Wednesday of the second week. Not an ambush, too visible, too many witnesses, and Draco was his father's son in enough ways to understand that witnesses mattered. He stepped into Harry's path in a corridor between the Transfiguration courtyard and the Great Hall, with two larger boys on either side, Crabbe and Goyle. Harry had identified them in the first 3 days, and the configuration was designed to be a social hierarchy demonstration, not a physical confrontation. Harry stopped and waited. Potter, Draco said. He had his father's measured quality but carried less of the patient calm. He was 11 and the patience was still being developed. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly, Draco Malfoy. I know who you are, Harry said. Same tone he'd used with Fudge. Matter of fact, Draco's expression flickered. Then you'll know that in the wizarding world there are certain. You're going to tell me that blood status matters and that your family is important and that you could be a good ally or a difficult enemy. Harry watched Draco's expression shift. Your father's version of that speech is better. He's had more practice. He paused. I met him at the ministry. He was measuring me. Draco stared at him. The two large boys on either side looked at each other. He did you no favors, Harry said, not cruelly, just as a statement of fact. Whatever he told you about me, he was working from tracking data and a 4-year-old's power readings. The current data is different. He looked at Draco with direct attention. I'm not your enemy, Draco. I'm not interested in being one. But I'm also not interested in performing whatever I'm supposed to perform for your family's long game, because I know what the game is and it doesn't go well for most of the people playing it. Draco's jaw was tight. He was working through several responses and discarding them. You have no idea. I have the ministry records from the Wisengamot filing, Harry said. Malfoy family involvement in ministry policy going back 20 years. Your father is intelligent and patient and good at working systems. He's also built his entire position around a version of the wizarding world that doesn't have me in it as a free agent. He looked at Draco steadily. None of that is your fault. You were born into it. Draco looked at him. His expression had moved through hostile and calculating and surprised and landed somewhere that didn't have a clean name. A look of someone encountering information that was disrupting a framework they'd relied on, and not knowing yet what to replace it with. The Muggle technology on your neck, Draco said. His tone had changed, still guarded, but the opening move aggressive quality was gone. My father finds it concerning. I know, Harry said. That's partly the point. He shifted his bag strap on his shoulder. I'm going to the Great Hall. Do you want to walk and be civilized about it, or do we do the bit where your friends try to be threatening and we all waste 20 minutes? Draco looked at Crabbe and Goyle, then at Harry. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of something different from what he'd walked into the corridor expecting to feel. Some other time, Draco said. Sure, Harry said, and walked past him and didn't look back. Ron was waiting at the junction of the corridor and the main hall and had clearly been watching the whole thing from enough distance not to appear to be watching. When Harry reached him, he said, that was either incredibly brave or incredibly mad. It was neither, Harry said. It was just direct. In Slytherin, they'd call that a gauntlet throw. In New York, they'd call it a reasonable conversation. Harry looked at Ron. He's not the problem. His father is the problem. Draco's just caught in the middle of it. Ron looked thoughtful in a way that suggested he was willing to be convinced, but that the Weasley family's history with the Malfoys was extensive enough to make it a slow process. He's still a prat, though. Yeah, Harry said, but we can work with that. Flying lessons happened on a Friday afternoon on the grounds, and Harry had been looking forward to them for reasons that were partly genuine enthusiasm for flight and partly technical. He'd never tested the suit's flight system in a proper open environment, and the broom flying lesson was going to give him a baseline for how Hogwarts airspace felt under the castle's magical field, which he needed for when he eventually activated the boot relays. The class was mixed Gryffindors and Slytherins. Madame Hooch was a brisk woman with yellow eyes, and a look that suggested she had been mediating house rivalries for long enough that she developed efficient systems for it. The incident with Neville's Remembrall started as the canonical dominoes. Neville got on his broom too enthusiastically after Madame Hooch said up, rose about a foot off the ground, lost control, and ended up on the ground with a broken wrist. Madame Hooch took him to the hospital wing, told everyone very clearly not to move from their spots, and left. Draco took the Remembrall out of Neville's abandoned bag, looked at it, and then looked at Harry. "Too bad Longbottom can't fly," Draco said, conversational. "I suppose we'll see if the boy who lived is actually any good at anything." He held the Remembrall up. Harry looked at the Remembrall. He looked at Draco. He looked at Neville's bag on the ground. The relay channels at his forearms lit. The Remembrall moved. Not toward Harry, it moved back into Neville's bag, which was on the ground 4 feet away, settling into the front pocket like it had been placed there by hand. Everyone stared at the bag. Then at Harry, who was still standing with his feet on the ground. Draco blinked. "How did you? Precision work," Harry said. "The suit helps." He looked at Draco with level attention. "Put Neville's things back. He's going to feel terrible when he gets out of the hospital wing. Don't make it worse." Draco looked at him, then at Neville's bag. Then, with an expression that mixed grudging and calculating, he put Neville's broom back in its place and said nothing more about it. Hermione, 2 spots down the line, was looking at the relay channels with the expression she got when her notes needed to be substantially revised. Ron was looking at Harry with the specific expression of someone who had just decided their first assessment of a person had been insufficient. "That," Ron said quietly, "was incredible." "It was the shortest path to the outcome I wanted," Harry said. "I didn't feel like chasing him around the field." "You could have, though," Ron said, looking at the relay channels. "Chased him." "Yeah, that's the thing," Ron said. "You could have and you didn't." Harry looked at him. Ron was looking back with the particular quality of someone who understood something about power that not everyone did. Harry thought, not for the first time, that Ron Weasley was significantly sharper than he chose to appear most of the time. "Exactly," Harry said. McGonagall found Harry after the lesson. Not in the dramatic theatrical way of the original timeline. She didn't arrive during the lesson or sweep him off to a private conversation. She appeared at his elbow as the class was walking back toward the castle and said, very quietly, "That was well handled. Thank you. The precision at 20 feet without active targeting. You've been practicing." "Every day since July," Harry said. "The accuracy is much better since the calibration." "I noticed." McGonagall walked in step with him, her voice low enough that only Harry could hear. "Quirrell spoke to me about the suit yesterday. He framed it as a teaching concern, interference with standard casting methodology for other students. I told him the suit's active emissions are below any threshold that would affect standard magical interactions." "Is that true?" "Essentially. The passive alignment is genuinely negligible to external observers." She paused. His follow-up question was about the inscription work. He wanted to know who performed it. Harry looked at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it was a ministry-approved collaboration between a Stark Industries contractor and a Hogwarts faculty member, and that the details were covered under the standard confidentiality provisions for student learning equipment." A pause. "He accepted that, but his interest in the inscription work is notable." "JARVIS flagged the same thing in class," Harry said. "The passenger is interested in how the runic architecture works, specifically the inversion of the suppression methodology." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "Tony is aware. I messaged him Tuesday. He's adjusted the emission profile to mask the amplitude data." Harry paused. "Professor, the 3rd floor, the stone. What about it?" "The passenger knows it's there. Quirrell is already probing the protection architecture. I could tell from the questions he was asking other teachers the first week. I wasn't near enough to hear specifics, but the pattern was clear." He looked at her. "When do you think Dumbledore expects it to happen?" McGonagall walked in silence for 3 seconds. which was the longest it took her to decide to be direct with him. He believes it will be an attempt before the end of the year. He has measures in place, measures that account for a suit that can interface remotely with an AI system. No, McGonagall said, they don't, because until last month no one in the castle had one of those. She looked at Harry. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that when it happens, it's going to go faster than Dumbledore expects, Harry said, and I want to be in a position to help rather than a position to hear about it afterwards. McGonagall looked at him. The expression on her face was the one she used when she was doing the calculation of a situation with full seriousness and minimal sentimentality. I'll speak to Albus, she said. Stay close to what you're doing. Keep logging. Yes, Professor. She peeled off toward the castle entrance and Harry went back to Ron and Hermione, who were debating the Remembrall incident. And he let them debate it and listened, and added a comment when it was useful, and kept his attention on the thread he was pulling. The mirror appeared in November. Harry found it on a Thursday night, following what had turned out to be one of Jarvis's better leads, a brief spike in the castle's deep magical signature, old and cold, the kind of reading that didn't come from any active magical process, but from something that had been in the castle for a very long time and was occasionally, briefly, active. The spike had come from the third floor, which was out of bounds, but it had been low enough and brief enough that Jarvis had flagged it as background rather than threat. Harry had been lying in the dormitory unable to sleep, and had read the Jarvis log and decided to look. He'd gotten out of the dormitory without waking anyone. The suit had a muffling capability at the relay channels that Tony had included specifically for situations requiring quiet movement, which dampened both his footsteps and the suit's ambient noise to below perceptible, and had navigated to the third floor with the suit's mapping systems guiding him through the relevant passages. The room he ended up in was not where the stone was. He checked the door with the three-headed dog. He could hear it sleeping from the corridor, the Jarvis proximity reading registering something large and multiply heartbeated, and the spike hadn't come from there. It had come from a different room, further down the corridor, a classroom that had been emptied and whose door was unlocked. The mirror was tall, taller than most people, in a heavy ornate frame with an inscription along the top, Eris stra eru oit ube kafru oit onwosi. Harry stood in front of it. He could see his reflection. That was normal. But there were other figures in the mirror behind his reflection, people who stood with him, and whose presence had a quality he had never felt in a mirror before. He looked at them. A woman with red hair and green eyes. A man with dark hair and glasses, who was standing with the loose, comfortable confidence of someone entirely at ease. Both of them were looking at him not with the longing quality of a vision, but with the specific particular warmth of people who knew him and were looking at him because he was there. His parents. Harry stood in front of the mirror for a long moment. He did not feel what he had expected to feel. He'd known this might happen. Jarvis had catalogued the mirror of Erised in the historical archive documentation from the Ministry files, had flagged it as powerful magical artifact, known to show the viewer's deepest desire. He'd read the flag and noted it. He'd understood it abstractly. The actual thing was different from the abstract understanding. He stood there for what was probably 3 minutes, looking at his parents, looking at the woman with his eyes and the man with his hair and glasses, and let himself be present with it rather than immediately processing it as data. Then he said quietly to the mirror, "I know what you show. I know it's not real." The reflection of his parents did not change. They kept looking at him with the warmth. "I know what I'd want," Harry said, "and I know it's not possible." He paused. "I'm okay. I have Tony. I have Pepper and Happy and Rhodey. I have Ron and Hermione now." He looked at the mirror. "I'm not going to keep coming back here." He looked at the mirror for another moment. Then he looked at the reflection itself, the physical surface of it, and the Jarvis proximity sensor gave him a read he hadn't expected. Something behind the mirror, contained within it, something that had a frequency signature he'd never logged before. Not the cold, old, deep signature of the castle. Not Quirrell's passenger. Something different. Something hidden. Harry leaned closer and looked at the mirror's surface, not at the reflection but through it, the way you look through glass when you wanted to see what was behind it rather than what it showed you. "Mr. Potter," Jarvis said very quietly, "the mirror has a secondary structure, beyond the reflective surface. The frequency signature is consistent with a powerful containment architecture, something being held inside the mirror's magical field. The stone." Harry stood back. He looked at the mirror for another moment. He took out the Stark phone from his pocket and messaged Tony, "Found something. Bring the updated sensor array. I found where the stone is." He looked at the reflection of his parents one more time. "Thank you," he said to the mirror, "for existing maybe, for showing him something true even if it wasn't possible." Then he turned and left, moving quietly back through the castle to Gryffindor Tower, the suit's monitoring running its steady ambient reads behind him, Jarvis logging every step. He passed the dormitory window and looked out at the Hogwarts grounds below, the dark lake and the forest edge and the sky with its November stars. And he thought about the cold, old, deep signature on the "He is ready" message, and about Quirrell's passenger's interest in the runic inscription work, and about the mirror containing the stone in a way that used the viewer's desire as a mechanism, which meant getting the stone required someone who wanted it but couldn't be driven by that want, which was an elegant protective mechanism that Dumbledore had clearly thought through carefully. He thought about his reflection in the mirror and what the mirror had shown him behind his parents, himself in the suit, with no chain on his ankle and no cupboard under the stairs and no cold old frequency measuring him from a distance. Just himself, capable and free. The mirror had shown him what he most deeply wanted, and it turned out to be not his parents alive, though that was there too, but himself as what he already was. Harry looked at that thought for a moment and then filed it away and went to bed. Tony's message came at 5 a.m., already on a plane. "Don't touch the mirror. We need to talk about the sensor data." And underneath that, "Good work. Seriously." Harry read it and put the phone away and slept until morning. Chapter 5 End.